It began in the shadows, not with a grand offensive or a sweeping maneuver, but with the quiet whisper of rain dripping through endless trees. The Hürtgen Forest Campaign, fought between September 1944 and February 1945, was not supposed to happen the way it did. It was meant to be a limited push, a simple operation to secure the flanks of the advancing US Army as it drove toward the Rhine. Instead, it became something far darker, a nightmare of mud, blood, and misery that swallowed tens of thousands of men and offered nothing in return. Deep in western Germany's dark, tangled woods, between Aachen and the Rover River, the American army found itself fighting not only the enemy, but the forest itself. The Germans called it Die Hölle im Wald, hell in the woods. For the soldiers who entered that place, it would be remembered simply as the meat grinder, the Hürtgen Forest, the battle that bled an army before the Bulge even began. By the autumn of 1944, the Allies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and stood on the doorstep of Germany itself. Victory seemed within reach. But as the front pushed eastward, the terrain changed. Gone were the open fields and hedgerows of France. Now came the dense, brooding forests of the Eifel Mountains, where pine trees blotted out the sun, and mist hung like smoke over ravines and ridges. The Hürtgen Forest was 20 miles long and 10 miles wide, a labyrinth of steep hills, mud-choked valleys, and twisting fire breaks. It was beautiful, in the way that only something utterly indifferent to human suffering can be, and it was perfect ground for defense. The German 7th Army, though battered and in retreat, had fortified the forest into a natural fortress. Bunkers, minefields, booby traps, and interlocking fields of fire that turned every tree into a potential death trap. Yet the Americans, eager to reach the Rhine, and convinced that resistance was collapsing, marched straight into it. The first attacks began in September 1944, when elements of the US 9th Infantry Division moved into the woods near Monchaux. What they found was not a front, but a nightmare. The dense canopy blocked radio signals. Maps were useless. Artillery shells exploded in the treetops, sending jagged wood and metal raining down. Tree bursts that shredded men where they stood. The mud was knee-deep. The rain never stopped. Soldiers fought blind, seeing only a few yards ahead, unable to tell friend from foe. Supply lines broke down, evacuating the wounded became impossible. Tanks bogged in mud or were trapped on narrow trails. The Germans, concealed in bunkers and pillboxes, struck again and again, vanishing into the trees before the Americans could respond. Days turned into weeks. Progress was measured in yards. Casualties mounted for no visible gain. Commanders rotated divisions in and out. The 4th, 28th, 8th and 1st Infantry Divisions, among others, each one fed into the same grinder, each one chewed up and exhausted. The 28th Division, known as the Bloody Bucket, suffered over 6,000 casualties in just a few weeks. The 4th Division fared no better. Morale disintegrated. Men went mad from the shelling, the damp, the endless tension. Some units advanced past their own dead, frozen and unburied, faces pale beneath the grey mist. The forest had no mercy. It stripped soldiers of everything, their bearings, their strength, their hope. Even veterans of Normandy said they had never seen anything like it. The Germans, commanded by General Erich Brandenberger, and later General Walter Model, knew the forest's power and used it to perfection. They understood that in Hürtgen numbers and firepower meant nothing. It was a battle of endurance, of patience, of attrition. Their strategy was simple. Let the Americans come to them, bleed them dry, delay the inevitable advance toward the Rhine. For Hitler, Every day the Allies spent in Hürtgen was another day for his forces to prepare for the coming counter-offensive, a massive strike through the Ardennes that would soon erupt as the Battle of the Bulge. In that sense, the forest was not just a battlefield, it was a smokescreen, a place designed to slow the Allies, to grind them down before the storm. By November, the forest had become a graveyard. The 22nd Infantry Regiment fought for 12 days to capture the village of Schmidt, only to lose it within hours to a counterattack. The 116th Regiment tried to seize the Rodder River dams, whose floodgates could drown the valleys below, but each assault was repelled with devastating losses. Air support was useless beneath the trees. Artillery couldn't reach targets hidden in the undergrowth. Every hill was a fortress, every clearing a killing field. The wounded froze where they fell. The dead were buried by shellfire. Entire companies vanished into the fog and were never seen again. It was not a war of movement or strategy. It was survival, day by day, tree by tree. In December 1944, as the Allies finally neared the edge of the forest, the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes exploded to the south, the Battle of the Bulge. Many of the divisions that might have reinforced the American lines were already shattered from Hürtgen. The men who stumbled out of those woods, hollow-eyed, frostbitten, and broken, were sent straight into another inferno. The Hürtgen campaign had lasted more than 3 months, cost over 33,000 American casualties, and achieved almost nothing. The Rodder River dams, the original objective, would not fall until February 1945. The forest had consumed everything: men, machines, morale, and given nothing back but ghosts. After the war, generals and historians alike struggled to explain why it happened. Why had the US Army persisted in such an unwinnable fight? Some blamed faulty intelligence, others pride. But for the soldiers who fought there, explanations were meaningless. They remembered only the endless trees, the rain, the smell of decay, the way the forest seemed to close in and never let go. Even decades later, veterans described Hürtgen not as a battle, but as a place that haunted them, a living thing that devoured hope and humanity alike. Today, the Hürtgen forest stands silent once more. The trees have regrown, the birds have returned, yet beneath that green canopy lies a cemetery without end. Thousands of men still missing, their bones mingled with the earth. They fought to claim rusted helmets, dog tags, and fragments of steel still emerge after every storm. The forest remembers, it always remembers. Tonight we return to that cold, endless labyrinth, where rain fell like bullets, where courage met futility, and where the U.S. Army learned that even victory can come at a cost too high to bear. This is the entire history of the Hürtgen Forest Campaign, the meat grinder before the Bulge, the forgotten nightmare of the Western Front, and the forest that swallowed an army. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? The Hürtgen Forest lies along the western edge of Germany, where the hills roll into the Eifel and the air tastes faintly of pine and rain. Its trees grow close together, forming a green cathedral so thick that daylight arrives in fragments. Wind drifts through the branches in soft murmurs, carrying the scent of damp moss and fallen needles. For centuries this forest has known the passing of seasons but little else, only hunters, villagers, and the distant hum of a Europe rebuilding itself after older wars. In autumn, a pale mist rises from the ground, wrapping every trunk in silence, until sound itself seems to vanish. The earth beneath is soft and uneven, covered in a carpet of needles that hushes every step. Streams wind quietly through the undergrowth, whispering in a language older than any border. Nothing here moves quickly. Even the birds seem to hesitate before crossing the shadows. The forest breathes slowly, as if aware of something approaching, and in that breath the world feels paused, waiting for footsteps not yet heard. There are places in the world that seem untouched by time, where each moment folds gently into the next. The Hürtgen is one of those places, a green labyrinth of patience and endurance. The trees stand as they have for generations, indifferent to the ambitions of men. Their roots sink deep into a soil rich with memory, their trunks rising like columns in a silent hall. When rain falls here, it falls softly, barely disturbing the stillness beneath the canopy. The light that filters through is not bright but muted, like the color of faded parchment. Travelers once spoke of this place as beautiful but heavy, a forest that holds its breath. It is easy to imagine that even the wind lowers its voice before entering. This quiet is not peace. It is something older, something waiting to be awakened. And in that waiting, the forest listens. Before the war reached it, the Hürtgen was known mostly to those who lived nearby. Foresters, shepherds, small families tending to their own narrow fields. Children walked its paths, collecting mushrooms and berries, believing it endless. The villages that dotted its edges, Schmidt, Vossenack, Jeremiter, existed in a rhythm of simplicity, marked by church bells and the turning of the seasons. The people knew the land's temperament, its fogs, its sudden storms, its unpredictable calm. They built their homes low and sturdy, knowing the forest's patience could outlast their own. When whispers of war returned to Europe, they reached the Hürtgen softly, like a rumor carried by the wind. Few believed that the world beyond could ever truly reach this quiet heart of green. Yet even the oldest among them felt a subtle unease, as if the trees themselves had grown restless. The forest, for all its silence, seemed to know what the people did not yet understand. And through the stillness the first faint echoes of war began to stir. Autumn deepened, and the colors changed from green to bronze, from bronze to the deep rust of dying leaves. The sky hung low and grey, pressing the air into something thick and heavy. The streams ran slower now, choked with fallen needles that whispered like old paper. In the mornings, frost clung to every branch, catching the pale light like shards of glass. Animals moved less often, their tracks fading quickly beneath the damp leaves. The forest began to take on an air of solemn expectation, as if aware of a presence approaching. The distant rumble of engines could sometimes be heard, faint and uncertain, like thunder still beyond the hills. To those who listened closely, the stillness no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. Somewhere between the trees and the mist, time itself seemed to hesitate, and the forest waited quietly for its peace to end. When the first soldiers appeared on its edges, they came not as conquerors but as guests of necessity. They carried maps that meant little here, for no map could show the density of this place, or the way it swallowed distance. The men spoke softly, their words disappearing into the fog before reaching another ear. Every sound, a snapped twig, a dropped canteen, seemed louder than it should have been. They were used to open fields and clear skies, not this tangle of trunks and shadows. Even the air felt foreign, thick with moisture and the slow decay of leaves. Somewhere deep inside, they knew the forest would not welcome them easily. Yet they entered all the same, guided by duty, by orders, by the belief that every step brought victory closer. The trees closed behind them like a curtain drawn over a stage. And just like that, the Hürtgen swallowed its first battalion. To the forest, Their arrival meant nothing, and everything. It did not change its rhythm for their presence. It did not stir in alarm or defiance. The fog thickened as it always did, curling around boots and barrels, softening the edges of uniforms and fear alike. The birds went quiet, sensing vibrations deeper than footsteps. Somewhere, a distant owl called once, then fell silent again. The men felt the strangeness of it. How this place seemed to erase the world they had known before. The road behind them felt longer now, almost forgotten. There was no sky here, only green darkness and the echo of rain. The forest seemed to be listening, as though weighing each heartbeat, and in that listening, a kind of understanding began. Not of victory, but of endurance. Days passed in quiet confusion. The men built shelters that melted into the earth, their tents heavy with moisture and shadow. Letters home were written slowly, the ink running in the damp air. Time lost its shape beneath the endless trees. The rhythm of days and nights blended into something shapeless, a long twilight of movement and waiting. Occasionally they heard artillery far away, a dull echo softened by miles of pine. But even that sound seemed hesitant, unwilling to disturb the stillness too much. They began to measure life not by progress, but by survival, one silent hour at a time. The forest, unchanged, accepted their presence without mercy or malice, and in the cold breath of each morning they learned that silence too can be an enemy. The Hürtgen forest had seen centuries of life without witnessing this kind of stillness. The stillness that comes not from peace but from waiting for pain. Yet even as soldiers and storms passed through, it remained itself, vast, damp, patient. Its soil absorbed everything without judgment, footsteps, fear, and the occasional prayer. It asked nothing, offered nothing. Only time moved here, and even that seemed reluctant. The men who entered would one day be gone, but the forest would remain, its roots tangled with memory. In the hush between wind and breath, something ancient seemed to whisper that all wars end, but the earth endures. The Hürtgen listened to those who would soon call it hell, though it had always been only what it was, a place of silence, deep and unbroken. And beneath that silence, the story of the battle was beginning to take root. September 1944 arrived with the promise of an ending. Across Western Europe, towns once crushed beneath occupation now hung out white sheets and flowers, celebrating liberation beneath skies still streaked with smoke. The Allied armies had swept from Normandy across France, their columns stretching for miles, engines humming with momentum. Men who had fought through hedgerows and fields began to believe that the next march might be their last. Letters home spoke of Christmas in peace, of roads leading straight to the Rhine and beyond. Maps on headquarters tables showed only a few jagged lines still marked in red, the Siegfried Line, Germany's final barrier. Few doubted it could be broken. The enemy seemed weary, retreating, hollowed by loss. Between the triumphs and the tiredness, hope began to settle like dust. But war, like the land itself, often hides its deepest trials in quiet places, and somewhere ahead, hidden behind green shadows and mist, the next trial was already waiting. The men of the US First Army advanced with a sense of practiced resolve, their boots pressing into roads littered with autumn leaves. Convoys rattled eastward through Belgium and Luxembourg, engines coughing in the cold morning air. They had seen much and endured more, but now they carried a lighter step, the rhythm of victory echoing in every mile. Villagers waved, children smiled, and church bells rang for the first time in years. Even the weather seemed to turn in their favor, days bright and crisp, nights calm enough to rest without fear. They believed the war was nearing its close, and that one final push would open the heart of Germany itself. Conversations at night were filled with talk of home, of plans that now felt close enough to touch. But hope can be a gentle deceiver, wrapping its warmth around those least ready for cold. The deeper they moved, the quieter the land became, until even the cheering villages faded into silence. And ahead of them, beyond the last open fields, stood the dark mass of the Hürtgen Forest. The Siegfried Line was a name spoken with more curiosity than dread. Maps called it the West Wall, a string of concrete bunkers, trenches, and dragon's teeth that guarded Germany's frontier. Intelligence reports described it as damaged, undermanned, perhaps already abandoned. Commanders believed that one swift push would collapse it entirely, opening the road to the Rhine. The men trusted those words, for trust was the only comfort they could afford. They had crossed France in weeks. How much worse could a few wooded hills be? The orders were clear: seize the approaches, hold the ridges, and prepare for the final assault. Tanks idled at the edge of the trees, their armor streaked with mud and anticipation. No one questioned what might lie within those shadows. And in that stillness before movement, the forest seemed to breathe, quietly, patiently, as if aware of what was coming toward it. Among the soldiers, the sense of nearing victory mixed with weariness. They had seen so much open country that the thought of another forest felt almost like a rest, a reprieve from the blinding openness of the plains. Some spoke of it as cover, a place where they might be safer from artillery or aircraft. The idea of concealment brought a strange comfort, even as the officers warned them that woods could deceive the eye. Rain began to fall lightly, a fine mist that clung to their gear and cooled their faces. Somewhere in the distance, artillery murmured like thunder over distant hills. It did not feel close, only persistent, like a storm too patient to fade. The line crept forward yard by yard, engines humming beneath the grey sky. Ahead, the first outlines of bunkers appeared, low shapes swallowed by moss and time. The men watched them without fear, unaware that these were merely the outer edges of something much deeper. And through the rain, the forest waited, its silence still unbroken. In headquarters tents, maps spread across wooden tables glowed beneath dim lantern light. The generals traced routes toward the Rhine, their fingers resting briefly on names like Monschau and Schmidt. There was talk of timing, of reaching the German border before winter turned the ground to ice. Supplies lagged, fuel was scarce, but confidence filled the gaps where certainty should have been. They believed in movement, in progress, in the idea that momentum itself was victory. Yet for all the plans and symbols on paper, the reality beneath those trees remained unmeasured. Radios crackled with cautious optimism. Reports of resistance brushed aside as the natural friction of advance. Every officer felt the pressure to keep moving, to make good on promises whispered since Normandy. The men in the field heard little of those meetings. They saw only the next hill, the next road, the next line of trees. And in that simplicity, the long shadow of the Hürtgen began to stretch quietly over them. By late September, the air had turned colder, and the first mists began to creep from the forest floor at dawn. Columns of infantry moved through the villages on its edge, Vossenack, Germeter, Lammersdorf, their boots echoing faintly in the empty streets. The locals watched silently from doorways, faces pale with a kind of knowing that no soldier yet shared. They had lived beside that forest all their lives, and they understood its temperament, beautiful but unforgiving. The soldiers smiled and waved, unaware of what those eyes had already seen in silence. Each step brought them closer to a world without horizon, where daylight would be broken into narrow slivers between pines. The forest gave no warning. It simply grew thicker, darker, more absolute. The sound of engines faded, replaced by the muffled rhythm of footsteps on damp earth. Even the air seemed different, stiller, heavier, as if holding its breath. And as they entered that threshold, the last light of open ground slipped quietly behind them. The forest greeted them, not with hostility, but with indifference. Its canopy closed overhead, filtering the grey sky into a dim green glow. Paths turned to mud, maps turned meaningless, and distance became a riddle. The men found themselves surrounded by trees so dense they could barely see 20 yards ahead. Every sound, the clink of a shovel, the rustle of gear, seemed swallowed almost instantly. They marched in silence now, guided more by instinct than direction. Some thought of home, others of nothing at all. The war had become quieter, slower, yet somehow heavier. It was not danger they felt, but a strange disquiet, the sense that the forest was watching, measuring each heartbeat. And beneath that watchful calm, the line continued to move forward, one uncertain step at a time. By the time the sun set on the first day, the forest had already begun to change them. The optimism that had carried them from Normandy softened into something quieter, not fear, not yet, but humility. The earth clung to their boots, the air pressed close, and the light dimmed long before evening. They built small fires that gave more smoke than warmth, their flames flickering weakly beneath dripping branches. No one spoke of the Siegfried Line anymore. It felt farther away than it had on any map. The men looked around at the endless trees and realized how easily they could be lost within them. Still, orders were orders, and the advance could not stop. Somewhere ahead the promise of victory still waited, just beyond the next ridge. They rested, ate in silence, and prepared to move again at dawn. And as night settled across the forest, the last whispers of confidence faded into the sound of wind through pines, soft, steady, and endless. They stepped into the forest as if entering another world, a place where light had forgotten how to fall. The canopy pressed close, sealing the sky beneath a ceiling of wet needles and shadow. Every branch dripped, every root twisted, every breath carried the scent of soil and rot. Boots sank into mud that seemed to pull with quiet insistence, as though the ground itself wished to keep them. The men walked in single file, their shapes swallowed by the green darkness within moments. Maps so clear in open country became useless here. Paths shifted, streams vanished, landmarks hid behind identical walls of trees. The compass was all that remained, its trembling needle the only promise of direction. Voices dropped to whispers, words muffled by the weight of damp air. Nothing in training had prepared them for this kind of stillness, this living maze of wood and fog. And as the forest closed around them, even time seemed to hesitate before moving forward again. The rain began softly, as if reluctant to intrude, but it soon turned into a steady mist that soaked through every layer of fabric and skin. It blurred outlines, merged colors, and filled the air with a steady rhythm that seemed eternal. Helmets glistened with droplets, rifles turned slick, and paper maps melted into unreadable shapes. There was no horizon, no wind, only the endless whisper of water and leaves. The men pressed onward, counting their steps as if numbers could replace direction. The deeper they went, the more the world shrank to the few feet around them, a narrow corridor of visibility and breath. Even sound carried strangely here, bouncing between trunks and fading into nothing, before it reached another ear. Each man became an island, isolated by fog and fatigue. The forest did not resist them. It simply absorbed them, quietly, completely, and beneath that gentle rhythm of rain, the forest's patience began to reveal itself. As they advanced, the air grew colder, heavier, and filled with the faint metallic tang of decaying leaves. The trees seemed endless, not tall in majesty, but dense in defiance, growing so close that movement felt like trespass. Communication lines faltered, radios hissed and died between the ridges, orders blurred, positions shifted, and no one could say exactly where the front began or ended. The enemy was invisible, hidden not just by cover, but by the very design of the land. A few shots echoed in the distance, dull and indistinct, like stones dropped into deep water. The men stopped, listened, and found only silence in return. Fear crept not through action but through absence, the growing awareness that they were being watched by something unseen. It was not battle they felt approaching, but a kind of quiet engulfment, and in that awareness the forest's presence deepened, like a living thing breathing just beyond sight. Nights were the hardest, for darkness inside the Hürtgen was different from any other. It came early and stayed late, pressing against the eyes even when open fires tried to hold it back. The glow of a cigarette could reveal a man's face and vanish it again in the space of a heartbeat. Every rustle became suspect, every drip a possible step. The mind played tricks in the silence, imagining movements that weren't there, conversations that had never been spoken. Sleep came in fragments, light and uneasy, broken by the cold that crept through blankets and bones. The forest never slept. It whispered through the branches, reminding them that they were guests, not conquerors. In daylight they would see how little they had moved, how close they still were to where they began. The ground itself seemed to turn them in circles, and through each night's damp breath, the forest grew darker still, not in color, but in memory. Days bled into one another with quiet monotony. The men learned to navigate by instinct, a bent branch, a certain stream, a half-buried track left by others. They advanced not by miles but by inches, measuring progress in the number of trees passed rather than the distance gained. Supply lines struggled to follow. Rations arrived late, ammunition damp, letters from home unreadable from rain. Yet there was no great panic, only a slow acceptance that this was not a place to conquer quickly. Their voices changed, growing quieter, slower, as though even words needed to adapt to the rhythm of the forest. They no longer spoke of Paris or Berlin or the Rhine. Their world had become roots and mud. The present moment stretched endlessly. The men began to resemble the forest itself, silent, enduring, marked by weather. And somewhere in that transformation, the line between man and landscape began to blur. Some officers tried to read maps by lantern light, tracing lines that no longer matched what they saw. Hills appeared where none were drawn. Roads vanished beneath the trees. The forest seemed to shift under their feet, as though alive and subtly unwilling to be known. Units lost contact with one another. Patrols circled back without realizing it, and messages traveled slower than the fog itself. The air smelled of resin and fatigue, of sweat and wet bark. In the distance, artillery rumbled like an approaching storm, but no one could tell from which direction it came. Every sound was a trick of echo and distance, folded by the trees until nothing was true anymore. The men followed orders, though each step felt less certain than the one before. Hope narrowed into endurance. Purpose became the act of continuing. And through it all the forest listened, patient, hungry, eternal. Occasionally the sun broke through. A pale disk glimpsed through trembling branches. For a few moments the world brightened, and men could see each other clearly again, faces streaked with mud, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. but still human, still present. They laughed briefly, the sound small but defiant, as if to remind themselves that they still existed beyond the forest's hold. Yet even the sunlight seemed fragile here, fading almost shyly before retreating behind clouds once more. The rain returned, washing away footprints, erasing any sign of progress. They were moving, yes, but toward what no one could say. The maps called this advance, but to those within it, it felt like drifting deeper into a vast green labyrinth. The thought of open fields and clear skies became something distant, almost imaginary. The forest wrapped around them again tighter and closer, and with each passing hour, its silence seemed less indifferent and more deliberate. By October, the men no longer spoke of the forest as terrain. They spoke of it as if it were alive. They gave it moods, tempers, even intentions. Some said it was angry, others said it was mourning. The truth was simpler, it was timeless, and they were not. The trees had seen generations pass, their roots drinking the same rain that now soaked through uniforms and skin. For the forest, these men were only a brief disturbance, a momentary whisper in centuries of stillness. Yet within that stillness their struggle had begun to take shape, quiet, unseen, but already costly. The war outside the trees still raged, but inside another kind of battle was beginning, slower, closer, more intimate. The men would come to call it the Green Hell, but to the forest it was simply another season passing, another echo fading into its endless calm. And as the line crept deeper into its heart, the forest finally began to close its hand. The fog settled low that morning, a pale shroud woven through the branches like breath turned visible. It hid the forest floor beneath a veil of moisture and silence, softening every outline until even the trees seemed uncertain of their own shapes. Men moved slowly through it, rifles held forward, each step deliberate and fearful. Somewhere beneath their boots, metal teeth waited patiently, planted months before by unseen hands. The forest had memorized where they were, though it offered no warning to those who entered. Every twig snap sounded louder than speech, and every pause carried the weight of decision. There was no horizon here, no sky to guide, only the endless whisper of pine needles above. The soldiers' world had shrunk to a few feet of vision and the pulse of their own hearts. A map was useless, a compass spun without promise, and in that grey stillness the forest began to feel alive, as though it listened. Each step forward became an act of faith. The ground soaked with rain seemed to sigh underfoot, soft yet full of menace. Some men began to watch where others stepped, memorizing the footprints that had not triggered disaster. But fog erased even that faint comfort, swallowing traces of safety in its pale breath. The trees stood like sentinels, unmoving, indifferent, their bark slick with the scent of decay. Minds were hidden in roots, in paths, in fields that looked innocent under the morning haze. It was not the enemy they feared now, but the silence that followed them wherever they went. When a distant detonation came, it did not echo. It was swallowed whole by mist. The noise was both sudden and gone, leaving behind an ache that could not be located. In this place danger had no face, it only had patience. The soldiers learnt to move as though walking through memory. Each motion was slow, rehearsed, almost ritualistic, like monks crossing sacred ground. Their breath condensed in the cold air, mingling with the fog until it became part of it. Communication fell away. Speech felt like trespass. Even the officers stopped giving orders aloud, for there was nothing left to command. Only to endure. The line did not advance. It simply existed, suspended between fear and exhaustion. Somewhere in the trees, German mines waited. Shoe mines, telemines, relics of engineering precision, now hidden beneath earth and leaves. Each one was a whisper of intent, invisible and final. The rain carried their scent deeper into the ground, masking any trace of warning. The forest was teaching them something, that control was an illusion. By midday, the fog thickened, turning sunlight into a dull grey wash that never quite reached the soil. Artillery began again, distant and irregular, as though testing the forest's endurance. Shrapnel hissed through leaves, but struck little, for the trees absorbed most of it. Like a great wooden wall, bark splintered, earth shifted, but the forest never screamed, it only exhaled and kept its silence. Soldiers crouched low, their helmets slick with condensation, listening to shells that came from nowhere and landed everywhere. No one could tell where the enemy began or ended. Maps had become abstract things, lines drawn on hope. The men followed not routes but instincts. In the fog, even time lost meaning. And so the forest became the only measure that mattered. By the third day, exhaustion had settled as deeply as the mist. Boots grew heavier, weighed down with mud that seemed unwilling to release them. Meals were eaten cold, if at all, as small fires gave away too much presence. The men learned to sleep sitting, backs against trees, rifles laid across their knees like weary companions. Sometimes they thought they heard voices, German, American, or imagined, but the forest turned all sound into echoes of itself. Every path looked familiar. Every familiar thing turned strange. The enemy could be 10 yards away or gone entirely. The fog did not discriminate. It gave its concealment to all. In that sameness, humanity began to blur. The forest had no sides, only shadows. When dawn came again, it brought no clarity, only a softer grey. Birds did not sing, though one could sense their watchful eyes above. The soldiers rose slowly, stretching joints that had stiffened in the night's damp. A few had begun to talk quietly of superstition, that the forest was haunted by those already lost. But superstition offered a kind of comfort because it meant there was something beyond randomness. In war, reason failed where mystery remained. Each minefield they crossed felt like trespassing on sacred ground, unseen yet sensed. Even the sound of a single twig cracking beneath a boot became unbearable. Every heartbeat was a countdown, though no one knew to what. And still they walked forward, because there was nothing else to do. By then the forest had learnt their rhythm. The cautious pace, the halting stops, the breath caught before the next step. It matched them, slowed them, absorbed them. Minds became the punctuation of this grim dialogue between man and nature. A distant explosion was no longer shocking. It was simply part of the landscape's breathing. Men flinched less, spoke less, thought less. Their fear became quiet, almost reverent. They were not fighting now. They were surviving within something ancient and indifferent. The fog seemed thicker when they prayed as though listening, and the forest, as always, said nothing in reply. The deeper they went, the stranger it felt to think of open spaces or sunlight. They began to forget what it looked like. A horizon unbroken by trees, a sky unfiltered by mist. Time itself grew soft, as if the forest absorbed it too. The only clear thing was the rhythm of movement. Step, pause, listen, breathe. Some men started marking trees with knives, leaving small cuts that meant, "I was here." But the bark wept sap over them by nightfall, healing as though refusing to remember. The world outside, the tanks, the cities, the generals, all faded into rumour. Only the earth beneath mattered, and what it chose to reveal or conceal. Every footfall was a question, and the ground answered in silence. The fog never lifted, only changed shape. As the week ended, the line still hadn't moved much. Reports came back uncertain, distorted by the weather, the terrain, and the fear. Some believed the Germans had already withdrawn. Others whispered they were everywhere. The forest itself had swallowed certainty whole. Even commanders began to measure success, not in distance, but in endurance. The fog and the mines had done what no artillery barrage could. They had taken control. The forest, it seemed, was the true strategist. Men merely walked its designs, pawns in a plan drawn long before they arrived. And when night fell once more, it fell like the closing of a vast soundless curtain, soft, inevitable, eternal. Hill 400 rose quietly from the forest floor, its slopes cloaked in mist and frost, like a secret waiting to be revealed. Paratroopers approached it slowly, boots sinking into sodden earth, hands gripping rifles that had grown heavy with rain. The climb was not steep, but each step demanded patience and effort, for the ground was slick and treacherous beneath the weight of wet gear. Branches bent under the moisture, dripping onto shoulders and faces, and the fog blurred the horizon, until the top seemed both near and impossibly distant. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of smoke and metal from distant fighting. Men paused often, catching breath, listening to the rhythm of the forest, and measuring the space between themselves and the ground ahead. It was not battle yet, only approach, but the forest had a way of testing them before the fight began. Confusion mingled with determination, and each soldier became attuned to the small details: a hollow in the soil, the angle of a branch, the echo of distant footsteps. Even in this silence, Hill 400 seemed to hum with expectation, and with every cautious step, the forest held its patience, waiting for the story to unfold. Snow began to fall as they climbed, fine flakes that dissolved into wet clothing and frost-bitten hair. Visibility shrank to a few yards, and the hill seemed to rise taller with each step, as if refusing to be measured or conquered. The soldiers moved together in small clusters, aware of each other's presence without needing words. Sleet began to sting, exposed skin, and rain continued to saturate boots and coats. The ground turned into a patchwork of mud and ice, making every footfall an act of focus. Occasionally, distant echoes, the sharp reports of artillery or rifle fire, reminded them that the forest beyond the hill remained alive with conflict. Each sound was softened by distance, yet carried a weight that tightened the chest. The men climbed steadily, measuring progress in inches rather than yards, in breaths rather than minutes. The forest seemed to lean inward, holding them in a quiet embrace that was both protective and relentless. And as they neared the summit, the top remained just out of reach, a line that drew them forward with invisible threads. Hill 400 was more than earth and trees. It was a sentinel of strategy, a point both coveted and cursed. Paratroopers reached its slopes in small, careful waves, each group treading where others had tested first. They had been trained to advance, to take ground, yet nothing in training had prepared them for the forest's mediation. It seemed to decide the pace, the direction, even the outcome. The trees clung to the hill like guardians, their branches tangled and dripping, forming barriers that slowed progress without resistance. Mud and snow conspired with gravity, forcing soldiers to use hands and knees to find purchase where none seemed to exist. The men encouraged each other quietly, small murmurs of guidance, but loud laughter and speech felt dangerous, as though the forest would notice. Their faces, streaked with rain and frost, carried concentration and exhaustion alike. Every step became an act of resilience, a small assertion of human will against the immovable presence of nature. And in that resilience, the hill began to take its place as more than a slope. It became a trial. As they reached mid-slopes, they noticed the evidence of prior efforts. Shallow trenches, broken trees, and disturbed earth told stories of those who had come before. Some had left footprints now faded in mud and ice, while others had vanished entirely into the forest's memory. The men pressed on cautiously, aware that progress came not from speed, but from attention. Their hands grew cold, their movements deliberate, their thoughts focused on the rhythm of ascent. Each pause became a small meditation, listening to the wind, the drip of water, the echo of distant artillery. The slope demanded patience, teaching endurance in a language without words. Above them the hill's crest wavered in fog, always just ahead, always a challenge to perception. They could not see the top, yet they felt it like a promise wrapped in mist, and with every inch gained, the forest seemed to watch, patient and unmoved. The closer they came to the summit, the more the forest seemed to compress around them. Trees leaned together, forming narrow corridors that funneled movement and slowed pace. Each footfall became louder in the hushed air, yet still swallowed quickly by fog and distance. Some men slipped, caught by slick roots, and others paused to help silently, hands steady in the cold and wet. The wind carried the faint scent of distant smoke, of earth turned by countless boots, of frost and rain combined. Soldiers learned to trust instinct over orders, to follow trails that the forest itself had made for them. Time passed differently here, measured not by minutes but by steps and breaths. They understood that exhaustion was not an enemy, but a companion, guiding their caution and focus. Even small accomplishments, a foothold found, a branch secured, became quietly significant, and as the last stretch of the hill approached, the top remained shrouded in fog, demanding patience and perseverance. At the summit, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Every tree, every branch, every rooted slope formed a quiet amphitheater around the men, a space of endurance rather than celebration. The wind was sharper here, cutting through layers of clothing and carrying with it the distant murmurs of conflict. Paratroopers paused to catch breath, to adjust packs, to look at what they could not fully see. Even without observation, the hill was a witness to human effort, a quiet keeper of trials endured. The fog softened edges, blending sky and land into a muted canvas. Here achievement felt intimate, almost private. A small assertion of will against a world that rarely yielded. Mud clung to boots like memory, and frost glazed every branch with the weight of permanence. The climb was not complete, for the forest beyond promised more, but this point held its own gravity, and in that gravity the men felt both the futility and the necessity of their task. Even at rest, the hill demanded attention. Men arranged themselves behind the sparse cover, listening to the rhythm of wind and branches. The forest had not stopped, had not yielded, and made clear that the ascent was never separate from the larger trial. Snowflakes settled softly on shoulders, melting into coats, and every breath became visible. A small witness to presence. The soldiers spoke little, for sound seemed too precious to waste. Each glance took in subtle shifts, a fallen branch, a shift in fog, a distant echo, and stored it for the moment when action might resume. They had climbed together, supported one another, and learned the limits of both landscape and body. The hill was neither enemy nor ally, only a measure of endurance. And as the evening drew near, the fog thickened around the summit, folding it into quiet anticipation for what came next. By nightfall, the forest around Hill 400 held a hush deeper than any day had offered. The ascent had tested bodies and minds alike, leaving men quiet, reflective, aware of the slow power of place. Their movements were careful, deliberate, and each moment of rest carried the weight of understanding. The slope had been conquered in part, but the forest reminded them that there were more trials ahead, more endurance to demand. The fog softened edges, flattened distinctions, and allowed the mind to drift toward memory, toward home, toward fort itself. Even in exhaustion, the soldiers felt a strange kinship with the landscape, a shared persistence against elements neither could fully command. The trees leaned closer as night fell, enclosing them gently, protectively, indefinitely, and within that gentle enclosure the line prepared for another day, carrying forward the quiet resolve that Hill 400 had demanded. The forest floor had changed, shifting from wet earth to a thick, unyielding mud that swallowed boots and wheels alike. Trucks and jeeps struggled through it, engines straining, treads spinning uselessly. The line slowed to an almost imperceptible crawl, and men began to measure progress, not by distance, but by moments. Rain fell steadily, seeping through clothes and coats, soaking hands that could not stop moving. Supplies lagged behind, packs grew heavier, and hunger crept quietly into the mind. Every attempt to advance became an exercise in patience and adaptation. Vehicles became inert monuments to effort, their metal hulls mired in earth that refused to release them. Soldiers moved around them, sometimes lifting, sometimes abandoning, always observing the slow negotiation between machine and mud. Even the strongest engines could not force their way forward. And as the day passed, the forest seemed to absorb the noise of machines into a soft, persistent silence. The mud did not discriminate. It enveloped the young and old, the weary and the steadfast. Horses and mules used for transport sank into the soft ground, hooves disappearing in the muck. The animals' low whines muffled by distance. Soldiers learned quickly that assistance could only do so much, and that movement was measured in inches rather than yards. Wounds were tended in place, bandages dampened by constant drizzle, supplies stretched thin across the line. The men spoke less, conserving energy, conserving warmth, conserving hope. Even the forest seemed to judge their struggle, its roots and soil unchanging and patient. A fallen tree became both obstacle and aid, a bridge over mud that threatened to swallow all else. The rhythm of effort became meditative, a cycle of push, pause, adjust, continue. Every breath carried the weight of persistence. Every step tested endurance. And in that rhythm, the human machine learned both its limits and its quiet resilience. Supply lines sagged under the weight of weather and terrain. Wagons tipped, leaving food and ammunition behind, and the soldiers adapted by sharing what little they could carry. Water collected in ruts and holes, mingling with mud and leaves, a murky reminder of the forest's absorption of all things. The soldiers' boots were thick with it. Their gait slowed, their focus narrowed to the ground beneath them. Engines coughed, stopped, and sometimes refused to start again, leaving men to drag them with cables and effort that tested the body and mind. They spoke in soft murmurs, giving directions to each other with the gentleness of shared understanding. Rain seeped into hair and jacket, cooling bodies that already carried fatigue like a second skin. The forest, silent and immutable, held no judgment, only presence. Even the air felt heavier, carrying moisture and a faint metallic tang. And in that dense, wet stillness, the human will seemed to expand quietly, pushing onward where machines could not. At times the line slowed so completely that men simply waited, leaning against vehicles stuck fast, hands resting on chilled metal. They shared brief words, small gestures, a shared sense of circumstance that required no explanation. Some soldiers paused to study the forest, noticing patterns in roots, streams, and tree trunks that offered subtle guidance. The mud taught observation and patience, and each small lesson felt profound in its simplicity. Supplies became sacred: a half loaf of bread, a handful of chocolate, a can of water that traveled farther than expected. The day stretched long, each hour folded into the next by the endless grey sky and persistent drizzle. Movement was not gone, but it had become rare, precious, and deliberate. Each inch gained required planning, strength, and quiet agreement between man and machine. And through it all, the forest listened and waited, unhurried and infinite. Men began to talk less of orders and more of persistence, of enduring without expectation of immediate results. Some measured their effort by how many vehicles had moved, how many steps had been taken, how many breaths remained warm. Injuries were tended with calm efficiency, without dramatization, as the forest demanded quiet discipline. Soldiers spoke of home in whispers, a mental anchor against the slow weight of mud and weather. Even laughter was soft, careful not to disturb the slow rhythm of survival. Rain blurred vision, muffled sound, and softened the edges of frustration. They learned to accept that sometimes the earth itself determined progress, not strategy or leadership. Each day became a meditation on endurance rather than triumph, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the line adapted to the forest's tempo, becoming part of its pulse. By the fourth day, exhaustion had layered itself over bodies and minds alike. Soldiers' hands were raw from constant effort, boots caked and heavy, shoulders stooped under packs, soaked through with rain. Machinery lay in quiet surrender, wheels spinning uselessly, engines silent and thick with mud. Small groups moved to assist one another, sharing strength and knowledge as much as food or tools. Silence became a shared language, broken only by the soft rhythm of steps and the occasional sigh. Even the wind seemed dampened, slowed by the forest and the heaviness of wet clothing. The mud was relentless, but not cruel. It did not punish, only slowed and absorbed. The forest itself seemed to embody time differently, teaching patience in the only way it could. And as evening fell, the soldiers learned to rest without shame, trusting that persistence did not require haste. Night brought a different kind of awareness. The mud became nearly invisible in darkness, but its presence was felt with every cautious step. Fires were small, low, and quickly smothered, more for warmth than light, casting shadows that danced across trunks, slick with rain. Conversations were whispers, sharing guidance, observations, and quiet companionship. Men imagined the ground as an active participant, measuring strength, patience, and resolve. Sleep came in broken fragments, often interrupted by the necessity of movement or care for others. Dreams were soft, abstract, folding the forest and mud into memory rather than immediate reality. Even the machinery, inert and mud-bound, seemed part of the forest's vast rhythm. And in that rhythm, soldiers understood a subtle truth. Persistence is not always measured by distance traveled, but by the quiet endurance of the self. By morning, the forest seemed to sigh with the weight of night, mist rising again from mud-soaked soil. Vehicles that had not moved the day before now stirred, but slowly, with calculated effort, as if testing the ground before committing to progress. Soldiers moved in harmony with the rhythm of the earth, adjusting steps, redistributing loads, finding small victories in inch-long advances. Each man became an interpreter of terrain, reading routes, puddles, and subtle gradients as though decoding a living text. The forest remained patient, unchanging, allowing progress, but on its own terms. Movement, however slow, became meditation. Each breath and motion integrated with the landscape. There was quiet satisfaction in small triumphs. A wheel freed, a path discovered, a ridge gained. The human machine faltered, adapted and learned humility under the weight of mud and rain. And as the morning stretched into day, the soldiers realized that endurance itself was a kind of victory. The forest stretched in every direction, a quiet expanse that refused to distinguish friend from foe. Soldiers from both sides moved within its green walls, each step measured, cautious, and uncertain. Letters found in packs told of homes, birthdays, and dreams of return. Words written in soft ink, fragile against the weight of the world outside. Diaries captured the rhythm of daily struggle, the endless negotiation with mud, roots, and rain. The Americans read these glimpses of humanity in their own reflections, imagining German voices whispering similar fears and hopes. The trees themselves offered no judgment, their silence equal to all who entered. Even the wind carried nothing but moisture and the faint smell of earth, indifferent to the cause of those who walked beneath. Soldiers became aware of a shared endurance, though it was quiet and unspoken. A bond formed in suffering that required no acknowledgement. Footsteps echoed softly on damp earth, fading into fog, and beneath that fog, the forest continued its timeless observation, patient and impartial. The German diaries described mornings that began with frost on coats and mud on boots, with breakfast swallowed quickly, often cold, as the mist crept through trees. Letters home were brief, written in haste, speaking of boredom and vigilance of comrades and small comforts stolen in passing. Some men noted the beauty of falling snow or the strange quiet of the forest before artillery spoke. Americans reading these words later found resonance in the same landscapes, the same struggle with wet clothing and endless marches. Both sides endured rain that never seemed to stop, fog that wrapped the forest in mystery, and nights that lasted longer than the sun would allow. Each soldier, regardless of uniform, measured the day in steps and breaths, in small victories against ground that resisted every advance. The forest swallowed all distinctions. Nationality, rank, expectation. Men learned to read patterns in roots and mud, to measure the patience of the earth itself. Even a shared shiver became a quiet human ritual, and in this shared ritual the forest grew larger, both a teacher and a devourer. Men moved slowly along ridges and hollowed paths, always alert to terrain more than to the enemy. The Americans recorded their experiences in letters they hoped would reach family, their words full of wonder and weariness, describing the forest as a living thing. German entries mirrored this, speaking of endless mud, the soft thud of boots against hidden hollows, the muffled sound of men moving unseen. Both groups remarked on the weight of rain, on the difficulty of maintaining fire, of keeping food dry. There were no triumphs in this passage, only persistence, small and continuous. Soldiers came to know the smell of wet wood, the soft suck of mud, the subtle change in light as fog thickened. Every tree could conceal both friend and foe, every root could trap both boot and thought. Letters described moments of humor or memory, brief glimmers of humanity, snatched in between duty and survival. In these mirrored reflections the forest seemed to listen, understanding neither side more than the other. And beneath that listening, men moved unbroken though quietly consumed. The fog thickened, folding the forest around the line like a soft, inescapable shroud. Steps became uncertain, muffled, yet deliberate. And even silence carried weight. Men learned to follow the paths others had left, not because they were safe, but because they offered guidance in a world otherwise incomprehensible. Diaries noted the strange sound of distant artillery, barely distinguishable from falling branches or shifting earth. Soldiers on both sides described the forest in the same words: endless, hungry, eternal. The earth absorbed all noise, and the air held nothing but moisture and patience. Hunger and fatigue became companions, not complaints, as the men measured life in small repeated movements. The forest ignored rank and uniform, asking only that those within it move carefully, breathe quietly, and endure. Footsteps in mud, the sigh of wind, the soft drip of water, these became the true markers of progress. And slowly awareness grew that the forest itself was the only constant presence in their world. Men began to note each other's patterns, even when unseen. The Americans saw how Germans carried packs, adjusted clothing, or paused in hollowed paths. Germans observed movements, gestures, and the weight of steps, though never with the expectation of confrontation. Both groups were caught in a cycle dictated by mud and root, rain and slope, endurance and patience. Diaries became daily mirrors of reflection, revealing the human capacity to adapt to a consuming landscape. The forest was no enemy, yet it was relentless, teaching lessons of endurance that could not be avoided. Letters that survived spoke softly of wonder, the shimmer of frost on branches, the scent of rain-slicked earth, the sound of wind caught in treetops. Men learned to find beauty in persistence, even when trapped. Every inch gained felt like negotiation rather than conquest, and the forest, patient as ever, continued to absorb all who entered its green expanse. Evenings brought a quiet reflection under low light filtered through misted branches. Soldiers huddled for warmth, sharing observations, stories, or quiet laughter. The lines between American and German experiences seemed less pronounced than the shared reality of mud, fog, and forested slopes. Each man carried fatigue and hope in equal measure, noting small successes in survival. The forest held everything, past and present, American and German, living and memory. Rain continued to fall, soft, insistent, a lullaby for those who could listen. Footsteps from earlier days were erased, yet the ground remembered all who had passed. Men wrote letters, recorded thoughts, or simply breathed, aware that the forest did not distinguish effort or cause. Even the wind seemed to acknowledge shared endurance rather than allegiance. And in that quiet evening, the forest itself became a silent witness to human resilience. By night the forest became almost tactile, heavy with moisture, sound, and expectation. Shadows moved, always shifting, always indistinct, as if the trees themselves were observing. Soldiers lay close together, listening to the rhythm of dripping water, the whisper of wind, the subtle creak of frost-laden branches. Diaries reflected on what it meant to exist in such a place, to endure without reward, to be seen only by a forest that claimed all equally. Both Americans and Germans noted the strange intimacy of isolation, the shared understanding that survival required observation, patience, and quiet courage. The forest made no distinction, no commentary, no judgment. Men rested in its embrace, even as their minds catalogued every lesson and every soft warning. Each step forward, the next day would be guided by memory, instinct, and the forest's quiet hand. The lion slept uneasily, comforted only by the repetition of its own persistence. And in that persistence, the forest waited patiently, eternal and impartial. By morning, the pale light revealed an unchanged forest, indifferent yet omnipresent. Men rose slowly, checking packs, securing rifles, breathing in the cold, wet air. Steps were deliberate, movements careful, each one a negotiation with mud, roots, and the unseen shape of the ground. Diaries and letters were folded carefully, tucked close, reminders of life outside the forest's green walls. The forest offered nothing but presence, and that was enough. Americans and Germans continued their mirrored passage, learning that endurance and patience were the only measures of progress. Silence became a companion, almost a comfort, and the forest's hunger was a quiet teacher. Movement resumed, small and unhurried, until paths widened again, or the slope eased, and as the line advanced slowly, the forest absorbed them once more, holding all within its immutable embrace. The fog rolled in slowly that morning, a pale tide that swallowed trees and ground alike. Patrols moved through it cautiously, each man aware that the next step could lead into emptiness. Sounds were muted, distorted, and often untraceable. A snapping branch could belong to a comrade, or to nothing at all. The forest had grown quiet in a different way, a kind of waiting that made the air heavier with expectation. Soldiers whispered in short phrases, voices soft, almost absorbed by the mist itself. Eyes scanned for movement, for hints of presence, but the more they looked, the less they trusted sight. Maps were abandoned as unreliable guides, replaced by instinct and memory of prior steps. The forest seemed to fold over itself, corridors appearing and vanishing in silence. Each patrol became its own isolated rhythm, separate from the next, yet part of a larger pattern of endurance, and beneath that rhythm, fear began to shape the forest as much as trees and fog. Men described the days later in letters and diaries, trying to capture the sensation of moving through a place that blurred time and space. Patrols that left at dawn sometimes returned at dusk, others never returned at all. The forest did not care which was which. Shadows seemed to move in soft waves, hints of shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Every step carried a tension born not of expectation but of the forest's patience. The wind whispered through branches, carrying echoes of footsteps, murmurs, and sometimes the faintest laughter that no one recognized. Soldiers learned to measure time in breaths and heartbeats, in small gestures of attention to what could be touched or felt, rather than seen. Each pause became meditation, each quiet movement an act of endurance. Even the strongest men began to feel the subtle erosion of certainty. And the forest waited, vast and impartial, for each soul that passed through. Patrols encountered the remains of previous journeys, not always human, sometimes just traces of passage, flattened branches, disturbed leaves, deep ruts in the mud. The forest seemed to remember, silently recording each presence and erasing it in the same breath. Soldiers sometimes found items dropped by those who had moved before, simple objects, a boot, a canteen, a notebook, that reminded them of the fragile continuity of life. They touched them lightly, more for comfort than utility, aware that survival was measured in moments rather than distance. Fog carried these traces far beyond their original place, folding memory over itself until nothing was absolute. Men began to whisper of ghosts, not spirits, but the feeling of absence and vigilance left behind by all who moved. Even without confrontation, tension grew, coiled in quiet muscles and racing hearts. The forest itself seemed to acknowledge the shared exhaustion, softening paths yet demanding attention. Movement became a dialogue with earth and fog, each step a negotiation of patience. And through it all the line persisted, spectral in its own way. Occasionally, patrols heard voices that seemed to drift just beyond comprehension, caught in the fog like smoke on the wind. It could have been a comrade, a lost German, or only imagination, but it was enough to unsettle the mind. Each whisper became part of the forest's rhythm, integrated into the quiet tension of the day. Soldiers learned to move as though the sound belonged to the forest itself, part of its breathing rather than a threat. The mist dulled sight and softened noise, yet sharpened focus in other ways, to touch, to balance, to patience. Movement became slower, more deliberate, each footfall measured against the last. The forest seemed to watch the rhythm, folding presence and absence into a continuous, unbroken sequence. Even hunger and cold faded into background, eclipsed by the attentiveness required for survival. Time became pliable, seconds stretching like the shadows between trees, and within that stretching, the soldiers found a strange kinship with the place that demanded as much as it concealed. Some patrols vanished into hollows or valleys, returning with tales of strange stillness, of branches that did not move, of footprints that seemed to appear without origin. The forest absorbed them, and yet the men returned changed, quieter, slower, more aware of the invisible weight pressing from all sides. Soldiers began to understand that heroism was quiet, measured in steps taken despite uncertainty. Notes and diaries spoke of emotional fatigue, not valor of endurance more than achievement. The fog made every action deliberate, every choice significant. Even mundane tasks, adjusting packs, drinking water, or stepping over a route, required full attention. Men learned to move without haste, to trust instincts honed by repeated presence in impossible terrain. Each patrol became a lesson in the patience of survival, the quiet work of presence, and the forest in its immutable silence seemed to measure that persistence, recording it in ways beyond human comprehension. Nights were particularly enigmatic, the mist turning into a thick, low cloud around the forest floor. Patrols at dusk became almost invisible, shadows folding into shadows, indistinct from fog or tree. Soldiers could hear each other breathing, feel the proximity of others, yet remain profoundly isolated. Whispers of distant movement created tension not from threat, but from expectation and uncertainty. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by imagined noises, or the gentle creak of frost-laden branches. Diaries recorded the subtle erosion of confidence, the gentle sharpening of senses, the emotional weight of vigilance. Men began to understand that the forest shaped not only the body, but the mind, imposing its own rhythm on thoughts and memory. Each dawn revealed paths subtly changed, obscured, renewed in fog and leaf. The line moved again, quiet and spectral, as though the forest had absorbed yesterday and created new terrain from it. And within this cycle, the emotional landscape became inseparable from the physical one. By midweek, the notion of a patrol shifted into something almost ceremonial. Movements were quiet, precise, carried with reverence for the ground and its unseen rules. Soldiers spoke less of objectives and more of survival, of reading signs and adapting to the forest's logic. Letters carried phrases like "the forest listens," or "we move as shadows," a testament to both fatigue and focus. Even German entries described the same spectral patience, the same quiet erosion of certainty, as fog and terrain dictated the day. Steps were deliberate, slow, and often repeated to test the ground. Each inch gained a meditation on effort. The line became less about confrontation and more about endurance. Each patrol a study in quiet presence, and the forest, impartial and enduring, folded them into its own rhythm, neither rewarding nor punishing, only observing. As the week drew to a close, patrols had become extensions of the fog itself. Slow, quiet, intangible. Men moved in near silence, hearts measured against the forest's own pulse. Diaries recorded small victories, a path navigated without incident, a supply delivered, a comrade supported, all infused with quiet relief rather than celebration. Even exhaustion was part of the rhythm, integrated into steps, breaths, and the soft crunch of mud underfoot. Fear had become an ambient companion, shaping motion rather than dominating thought. Letters written by night reflected the subtle erosion of heroism into endurance, of courage into continued presence, and in every heartbeat, every step, every whispered exchange, the forest remained impartial, eternal, and absorbing. The line advanced like ghosts, spectral and patient, moving through a landscape shaped more by perception than terrain, and through the mist it seemed that the forest had claimed yet another quiet understanding of those who passed through it. From distant headquarters, maps sprawled across tables, lines, and symbols, representing terrain that few would ever see. Leaders studied them with careful attention, making decisions based on measurements and predictions, unaware of the subtle shifting mud beneath soldiers' boots. The forest below remained indifferent to charts or calculations, silent and patient as men struggled to move within its green walls. Reports arrived slowly, filtered through misted weather and exhausted couriers, often delayed or misinterpreted. Orders were given, repeated, and adjusted, yet the ground could not be commanded, only negotiated with commanders considered terrain, supply lines, and enemy positions, unaware of the slow absorption of both by weather, fatigue, and the forest itself. Soldiers in foxholes moved according to instinct rather than instruction, acting as individual units within a larger pattern unseen by those far away. Each report brought more information, yet clarity remained elusive. The forest and the fog formed a boundary that no strategy could fully pierce, and in this distance the weight of decisions felt almost ethereal, measured not in maps but in men. The generals considered progress and attrition in abstract terms, numbers on a page rather than breaths and steps. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Hodges debated priorities and timing, unaware of how rapidly terrain altered perception and possibility. Soldiers climbed slopes, trudged through mud, and waited in hollowed paths, each step creating a reality unseen by those issuing orders. Mist softened edges, flattened distances, and rendered many calculations nearly irrelevant. Reports were fragmented, often contradictory, describing both forward motion and stagnation. Headquarters attempted to coordinate movements, yet the forest reshaped all predictions with patient indifference. Supplies arrived late, misdirected, or abandoned in mud, a silent testament to the gap between plan and experience. Officers in foxholes understood the mismatch intuitively, adapting continuously to terrain and weather. Every decision made on paper was tempered by the stubborn, unyielding forest below, and in that tempering, the forest silently measured both ambition and endurance. Men spoke quietly among themselves of supply shortages, the unpredictability of the ground, and the relentless weather. Commanders far away spoke in numbers, dates, and diagrams, unaware of hands raw from frost or eyes strained from fog. The forest did not care for rank or intention. It only responded to presence and persistence. Soldiers learned to act within uncertainty, to measure their own strength against terrain that ignored expectation. Letters home noted the disconnect between orders received and conditions experienced. A soft protest folded into narrative. The mud became a mediator between strategy and survival, a language that only those present could fully understand. Maps represented potential, but the forest dictated actuality, turning planning into suggestion rather than prescription. Every inch gained was measured against effort, patience, and quiet observation. And as reports were filed back to headquarters, the forest absorbed the truth of human struggle in silence. Patrols navigated paths dictated by earth rather than command. tracing routes that were present one day and altered the next. Generals debated objectives in offices, unaware that paths and hills held memory and expectation unknown to paper. Men measured time in movement, in breaths, in quiet moments of adjustment and preparation. The forest shifted imperceptibly, hiding and revealing paths, as though rewriting its own plan. Communication was slow, often arriving after its relevance had faded. Soldiers improvised constantly, transforming intention into motion that was invisible to those giving orders. The weight of authority, distant yet absolute, pressed softly over the forest, unable to affect the subtle but unyielding terrain. Even reports from scouts were filtered, softened, and delayed, leaving planners to imagine conditions rather than perceive them. And in every pause, every careful step, the forest reminded all present that control was an illusion. Maps depicted roads and ridges, rivers and forests, but they could not convey the subtle dangers of roots, mud, or frost. Leaders assumed progress according to expected movement rates, unaware that weather could halt machinery, obscure trails, and alter landscapes in hours. Soldiers trudged through narrow corridors, over fallen trees, and across frozen mud, guided by experience and instinct, rather than any distant directive. Every misjudgment of terrain became magnified in human effort. A wheel stuck, a pack slowed, a breath caught. Orders arrived without knowledge of conditions, and men adjusted silently, carrying out intentions that often diverged from plans. The forest watched without judgment, absorbing action, fatigue, and hope. Even small accomplishments, a ridge gained, a path cleared, held significance beyond what maps could capture. Soldiers recorded these moments in diaries and letters, fleeting testaments to resilience, and from distant tables, generals relied on reports and charts, unable to perceive the rhythm of reality below. Tension grew both in the field and in headquarters. Though in very different ways, in the forest movement required patience, skill, and quiet endurance, while at tables debate and expectation created pressure that could not be translated into the earth. Commanders feared delays and missteps, unaware that terrain was the truer arbiter. Soldiers measured progress in breaths, in mud-clogged boots, in careful negotiation with trees and roots. Weather intervened constantly, reshaping reality, while strategies remained abstract and constant. Letters described nights spent adjusting to frost, mud, and vigilance, while generals reviewed maps under lamplight, distant and detached. The forest did not lie, nor did it judge. It only persisted. Soldiers adapted, improvised, and endured, guided by proximity rather than plan. And in this ongoing negotiation, the forest became a silent partner in the fate of men, indifferent yet omnipresent. By mid-campaign, the cumulative effect of command without vision became apparent. Men recognized the gap between expectation and reality, between plan and forest. Every step, every pause, every adjustment reflected a quiet negotiation with terrain rather than authority. Generals attempted to reconcile reports with maps, but the forest had its own memory and timing. Soldiers wrote of exhaustion, patience, and minor triumphs, their words folding the forest's unyielding presence into human understanding. Mud, fog, and slope dictated movement more effectively than orders ever could. Decisions made in distant rooms carried weight, yet rarely aligned with experience on the ground. Every inch gained reflected not strategy alone, but endurance, adaptation, and subtle collaboration with the land itself. And as the campaign pressed forward, the forest remained a patient witness to both human ambition and its limits. By the end of the day, the forest had once again claimed dominion over perception and motion. Headquarters measured progress in miles and men, unaware of the small victories and quiet compromises that defined survival below. Soldiers rested with boots caked in mud, hearts slow from effort, minds sharp from constant adaptation. The gap between command and action remained, yet the line pressed forward nonetheless. Guided by patience and instinct, mist hovered over slopes and ridges, softening edges and erasing distinction between path and forest floor. Diaries captured this dissonance, blending observation, endurance, and reflection into quiet record. The human machine faltered, adapted, and continued, carrying both orders and reality with measured care. And beneath it all, the forest observed, patient, impartial, and eternal. The forest seemed to hold its breath before the first flare of light struck the pines. Smoke rose in pale columns, mingling with fog and mist, softening edges yet thickening the air. Soldiers moved cautiously, aware that the very landscape around them had shifted, transformed from patient observer into active presence. Flames licked branches, consuming dry needles and fallen leaves, while embers drifted gently like glowing insects caught in a breeze. The heat was insistent but not unbearable, pressing against faces and hands, reminding each man of the forest's indifference. Sound became warped. The snap and crackle of fire echoed strangely among trunks and hollows, carrying both warning and rhythm. Footsteps were measured, movements deliberate, as the line learned to navigate a terrain newly defined by light and smoke. Diaries and letters spoke of awe and unease, of beauty and danger intertwined. Every breath carried the scent of pine and smoke, the taste of survival mingled with reflection, and as men pressed forward, the forest itself seemed to pulse with new energy, both threatening and alive. The fire revealed contours of the land that had been hidden beneath fog and shadow. Ridges glowed faintly, hollows deepened, and paths became visible in the flickering light. Soldiers adjusted continuously, responding to heat, smoke, and shifting footing. The forest seemed to move as much as they did, bending perception, softening steps, and testing patience. Flames rose and fell with the wind, as though breathing with intention, neither cruel nor considerate. Men shared quiet directions, whispered warnings, and brief words of reassurance, small anchors in a place transformed. Even the air was alive, carrying warmth, light, and the subtle roar of combustion that both illuminated and obscured. Smoke clung to clothing, hair and skin, a tangible reminder of the forest's reach and dominance. Each step became an act of negotiation, not force, as the fire dictated motion and attention. And beneath the glow, men learned again the delicate balance between persistence and surrender. The pines, once patient, became a labyrinth of light and shadow, their outlines blurred by smoke. Soldiers found themselves navigating between pockets of flame, roots softened by heat, and ash that shifted beneath boots. Letters described the strange juxtaposition of danger and fascination, a beauty that could not be possessed, only witnessed. The fire illuminated both terrain and tension, highlighting the persistence required to continue through change. Movement slowed, measured not by strategy, but by immediate necessity and instinct. Sound became rhythm rather than noise. The crackle of flame, the whisper of heat across needles, the soft patter of footsteps on ash. Men felt both awe and humility, aware that the forest's force was neither personal nor partial. Even the smallest gestures, adjusting a coat, securing a pack, taking a breath, required mindfulness. Each ridge, each hollow, each ember-laden gust was a quiet teacher, and through it all, the line continued, patient, observant, and unbroken. Smoke rose higher, obscuring the sky, turning the forest into a soft, swirling haze of gold and grey. Sunlight, filtered and muted, softened the intensity of heat, yet deepened the awareness of movement. Soldiers adapted, timing each step between flickers of fire, learning to anticipate the wind's shift and the fall of burning needles. The forest seemed to guide them subtly, offering openings and concealing obstacles in equal measure. The rhythm of survival became intertwined with the pulse of flame, each step both cautious and meditative. Embers drifted silently, landing and extinguishing themselves, carrying the quiet energy of the forest's transformation. Letters and diaries recorded a mix of reverence and reflection, an attempt to capture fleeting understanding without diminishing the moment. Every breath was a small victory, a claim to presence in a forest that had become both challenge and teacher. Soldiers moved like shadows, aware of the fragility of life and the enduring patience of the landscape, and in that movement, the fire itself seemed less a threat than a mirror of persistence. As night approached, the fire's glow softened into ribbons of orange and red, illuminating trunks and mist in alternating patterns of warmth and shadow. Soldiers paused occasionally, listening to the forest breathe, inhaling the subtle scent of pine resin and ash. The landscape had changed, yet it remained the forest, patient, immense, and indifferent. Movement required care, each footfall measured against heat, smoke, and the unyielding rhythm of time. Men whispered observations, shared directions, and recorded moments in their own quiet way, seeking understanding through endurance. The fire, though fierce, revealed hidden beauty, the play of light on leaves, the shimmer of smoke in air thick with moisture, the soft contrast of shadow against glow. Each ridge and hollow became an exercise in mindfulness, teaching caution, observation, and presence. Soldiers began to appreciate the forest not as an adversary, but as a persistent and exacting teacher. Their steps continued, deliberate, flowing with the contours of fire and earth, and beneath it all, the forest watched, absorbing each action and intention without judgment. The air grew thick, charged with warmth and moisture, carrying a weight that pressed softly against skin and mind. The line moved slowly, navigating the interplay of flame, mist, and fallen timber. Each man relied on memory, instinct, and quiet guidance from those ahead. The forest's rhythm dictated the pace, teaching patience through the language of fire and earth. Letters spoke of awe and survival, of wonder entwined with effort, capturing the subtle intensity of days transformed. Smoke clung to the trees, curling around trunks and branches like invisible threads. Even silence became meaningful, a companion in the midst of heat and color. Footsteps were careful, deliberate, and shared, each movement a negotiation with the living forest. And in that negotiation, men found a fragile harmony between endurance, observation, and presence. By the end of day, the forest settled into an uneasy quiet, smoke curling toward higher branches and embers glowing softly among needles. Soldiers paused to breathe, aware of the transformation around them, grateful for small moments of stillness. The fire, once urgent and assertive, now softened into gentle reminders of presence, change, and adaptation. Diaries captured the mix of tension and awe, the merging of challenge with reflection. Men moved carefully, carrying lessons learned in both movement and patience. Even in fatigue, they felt the pulse of the forest, alive with rhythm, smoke, and shadow. The line advanced slowly yet surely, guided by instinct, observation, and quiet persistence. And in that advancing, The forest remained eternal, patient and absorbing, a witness to human endurance in firelit silence. As night drew in, flames cooled to flickers, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Soldiers rested where possible, listening to the crackle fade and the wind settle. Smoke hung in the air like a soft veil, reminding all that the forest's presence remained, patient and immutable. Every breath, every step, and every whisper became part of a quiet rhythm, shared with the earth, the trees, and the lingering embers. Diaries and letters would later record these moments, capturing understanding without embellishment, reflecting a fragile harmony between endurance and observation. The forest, transformed by fire, yet unchanged in essence, remained an impartial witness to human presence. Soldiers learned again that survival required not dominance but awareness, patience, and integration with the land. And as they pressed onward, the soft glow of embers carried them toward paths yet unknown, the lessons of fire lingering in every measured step. The first snow fell quietly, descending like feathers through the dense forest. Soldiers paused in their movements, feeling the cold settle softly over shoulders and helmets. Branches, once vibrant with the slow decay of autumn, now bore white weight, bending and bowing in gentle surrender. The ground softened underfoot, muffling steps and absorbing small noises into an expanding quiet. Even the forest itself seemed to hold a longer breath, as though anticipating the change in rhythm brought by winter. Letters spoke of frost on lips, the cold seeping through clothing, and the strange beauty of snow-laden trees. Men moved slowly, each step deliberate, aware of the fragile layer that concealed both past and present. The cold sharpened perception, while dulling sensation, creating a paradox of clarity and numbness. Every pause became a meditation, each breath a quiet acknowledgement of endurance. And beneath that falling snow, the forest seemed to sleep, patient and indifferent. Snow drifted along hollowed paths, softening hollows and ridges, rendering familiar terrain strange and new. Soldiers adjusted, balancing boots on hidden roots, listening for muffled sounds beneath the white blanket. The forest, once alive with subtle noise, now seemed a vast cathedral of silence. Its walls softened and light diffused. Diaries reflected on the paradox of quiet. The absence of fire and gunfire was relief, yet heavier in its stillness. Men moved in pairs or small groups, voices hushed, gestures minimal, each action weighted by cold and caution. The snow absorbed missteps and footsteps alike, erasing evidence of passage and lending both freedom and uncertainty. Letters described hands numbed, feet aching, faces wind-burned, yet hearts quietly persistent. The forest embraced them with patient impartiality, indifferent to hardship or accomplishment. Every ridge, hollow and fallen branch became a study in endurance, and as the line advanced, the snow deepened, softening edges and slowing time. The white expanse covered all traces of prior battle, muting echoes that once carried through hollows. Soldiers felt the contrast. The absence of noise was comforting yet disorienting. Diaries recorded the sensation of being simultaneously alone and together, each breath visible in cold air, a quiet reminder of life persisting. The snow reflected light softly, illuminating trunks and branches, with muted tones of grey and silver. Movement became deliberate, rhythm measured by balance, breathing, and the soft crunch beneath boots. Letters captured the stillness, noting moments of reflection, gratitude, or quiet concern for comrades unseen. Even the forest seemed to slow, the pines heavy with snow, the branches bending as though bowing under weight. Men learned to conserve energy, moving with subtle precision and mindful attention. Frost accumulated on packs, weapons and clothing, each crystal a fragile marker of endurance. And beneath it all, the forest's quiet presence seemed more absolute than ever. Snowflakes drifted against faces, melting slowly, a reminder of warmth within and cold without. Soldiers paused to adjust gloves, scarves, and coats, small gestures of comfort amidst endurance. Paths previously clear were now softened, hollowed, and unfamiliar, inviting careful observation and measured steps. The forest absorbed sound, movement, and intent, teaching men to move with quiet patience. Diaries recorded fatigue in measured words, the soft acknowledgement of survival, more than triumph. Even minor tasks became exercises in mindfulness. Lifting a boot, shifting a pack, breathing steadily. The snow amplified both beauty and isolation, emphasizing the contrast between delicate patterns and harsh endurance. Men moved almost ceremonially, aware of the forest's watchful impartiality. Silence deepened, layering over memory, expectation, and thought, and through it the line continued, careful and deliberate, beneath the falling snow. In some hollows, snow accumulated more heavily, forming drifts that required attention and adjustment. Soldiers negotiated each mound, testing footing and observing hidden roots or fallen branches. The forest seemed to expand under the snow, enveloping men in a hushed white cocoon. Letters noted the sensation of small triumphs, reaching a ridge, crossing a hollow, adjusting to new conditions, magnified by quiet and cold. Even the forest floor, once a tangle of mud and debris, now offered a soft yet deceptive path. The wind carried frost and whispers of distant pines, creating patterns that shifted subtly with every gust. Diaries recorded a mixture of awe and endurance, the snow transforming fear into quiet focus. Movements were synchronized to breath and step, a meditation in motion. The forest responded, indifferent yet present, shaping every passage through patience and subtle guidance. And beneath the shifting snow, men found a fragile rhythm, fragile yet sustaining. Evenings brought longer shadows, softening the forest further under muted light. Soldiers gathered in hollows, resting where possible, mindful of warmth, proximity, and conservation of energy. The snow reflected residual light, illuminating branches and trunks with gentle clarity. Men whispered quietly, sharing observations, letters, or small comforts, aware that the forest was both shelter and observer. Diaries captured the stillness, noting the paradox of peace heavy with awareness. Footsteps became softer, the crunch of snow under boots, a metronome for patience and endurance. The forest absorbed sound, preserving rhythm and echo in ways imperceptible yet intimate. Every pause became intentional, every breath deliberate, as men adjusted to the slowed pace. The white blanket muted extremes, yet highlighted endurance, patience, and observation. And in this softened night, the forest seemed to hold its own breath alongside the line. Snow softened, yet revealed new dangers. Hollows, hidden roots, and subtle inclines that required careful negotiation. Soldiers moved slowly, scanning, stepping, and adjusting, attuned to the quiet terrain. Letters spoke of cold settling into bones, hands red and stiff, yet a persistent sense of presence and perseverance remained. The forest seemed alive in stillness, teaching lessons without sound, motion, or intervention. Diaries recorded each ridge crossed, each hollow navigated, small victories magnified by the quiet challenge of winter. Breath condensed in air, marking presence in space, reminding men of continuity and life amidst uncertainty. Even silence carried weight, a pause that held memory, thought, and observation simultaneously. The snow absorbed errors, footsteps, and sound, leaving only subtle traces of endurance. Men adapted, learned, and continued, guided by instinct, caution, and patience. And beneath this soft expanse, the forest remained eternal, impartial, and attentive. By the end of the day, the forest lay blanketed, quiet, and still, a canvas for both reflection and survival. Soldiers paused, checking boots, packs, and companions, aware that the snow could conceal both hazard and path alike. Diaries and letters captured a muted beauty, a sense of continuity, and the patient persistence required to endure. Trees bent softly under snow, roots concealed yet steadfast, teaching the quiet lessons of patience and observation. Even the wind seemed gentler, softened by accumulation, carrying only distant whispers. Steps slowed further, movements deliberate, each one a meditation in endurance. Men breathed in rhythm with the forest, aware of fragility and persistence simultaneously. The line continued, careful and measured, beneath the vast white canopy, and through it all the forest watched silently, patient and indifferent, preserving lessons in both snow and shadow. December settled over the forest slowly, a pale quiet that seemed to stretch across every ridge and hollow. Soldiers huddled in trenches and foxholes, blankets pulled tight, fingers pressed against frost-bitten seams. The wind whispered through branches, carrying with it a cold that seeped beneath clothing and into bones. Each day passed in measured rhythm, observation, adjustment, small repairs, and quiet notes scribbled on paper. Men wrote letters home, their words careful, reflecting hope, longing, and the subdued rhythm of patience. Commanders studied maps, debated supply, and wrestled with uncertainty, aware that the next movement might be decisive. The forest seemed to hold its breath alongside them, indifferent yet encompassing, offering shelter and challenge simultaneously. Silence was pervasive, a tension that was neither loud nor insistent, yet heavy in its constancy. Soldiers moved slowly, aware of every step, every whisper of wind or creak of timber beneath snow. And in this measured quiet, the forest seemed to mark the passage of time gently, without hurry. Rations were distributed carefully, small gestures of sustenance that reminded men of both routine and fragility. The forest absorbed the faint sounds of shuffling boots, whispers, and the occasional snap of a branch under frost. Letters became lifelines, small bridges between the distant warmth of home and the stark cold of wintered terrain. Commanders' eyes traced lines on maps, knowing that decisions weighed on both paper and human endurance. Soldiers observed the soft patterns of snow on branches, the quiet drift of wind along the ridges, and the faint glimmer of distant light through pines. Even the forest floor, hidden beneath layers of frost and white, seemed a measured guide for careful movement. Each day blended into the next, a quiet repetition that carried both hope and anxiety. Men paused to adjust packs, gloves, and breathing, subtle gestures of preservation. The stillness amplified attention, sharpening senses dulled by fatigue and cold. And beneath this calm, the first whispers of what would become the Battle of the Bulge lingered, just beyond perception. Huddled groups shared quiet conversation, words soft yet meaningful, a network of observation and care. Frost traced edges of clothing, helmets and hands, delicate patterns that mirrored the silence around them. Soldiers noted small details, the shape of a ridge, a hollow's depth, the faint movement of animals through snow. Diaries and letters captured observations of weather, fatigue, and camaraderie, a record of patient endurance. Commanders reviewed plans, aware that shifts in supply or morale could alter the next week's outcome. Men moved deliberately, conserving energy while maintaining readiness, aware that each gesture carried significance. The forest offered both challenge and comfort, each tree a subtle guide, each hollow a place of temporary shelter. Even silence seemed alive, carrying rhythm and attention across snow and timber. Every breath became deliberate, each moment of waiting a quiet exercise in presence. And in this rhythm, soldiers found both tension and fragile calm, poised for what was to come. Snow drifted across foxholes and trenches, softening edges, concealing details, and demanding awareness. Soldiers adjusted to the subtle shifts of terrain, learning once again that careful attention preserved life more than haste. Letters were read and reread, folded and carried close, offering warmth of connection amid cold and stillness. Commanders conversed quietly, decisions layered with uncertainty, their voices subdued by frost-laden wind. Men moved in silence, sharing small gestures of care, adjusting boots, handing blankets, whispering guidance. The forest seemed to absorb all sound and presence, patient and impartial, marking passage through observation alone. Even the smallest actions, lifting a pack, stepping over a branch, pausing to breathe, carried intentional weight. Diaries recorded reflections, noting the soft rhythm of waiting, the subtle erosion of certainty, and the persistence of awareness. Every ridge and hollow became both challenge and quiet meditation, a space to observe self and surroundings. And beneath the white canopy, time seemed to stretch slowly, measured in breath, frost, and quiet vigilance. As dusk approached, the light softened into muted tones of grey and silver, diffused through frozen branches. Soldiers paused to observe, noting the shift in shadows, the quiet settling of snow, and the subtle sounds of wind through needles. Letters were written by dim lantern or careful pencil, small expressions of presence, connection, and endurance. Commanders lingered over maps, aware of both advantage and uncertainty, reading terrain as much as reports. Men in foxholes adjusted clothing packs and sleeping arrangements, careful to conserve warmth while remaining ready. The forest absorbed movement and sound, patient and constant, teaching lessons through presence rather than intervention. Even silence was instructional, guiding attention to detail, rhythm, and subtle patterns. Footsteps were measured, movements deliberate, breathing quiet and synchronized with environmental cues. Each day passed slowly, each night more reflective, a meditation in motion and stillness. And through this calm, the tension of what lay beyond the trees remained, waiting quietly like a shadow at the edge of perception. Some soldiers wandered small distances from their dugouts, observing terrain, testing footing, or simply moving for circulation. Snow shifted under their boots, revealing subtle variations in slope and hollow. Letters became bridges, connecting observation and endurance to distant homes. Commanders considered weather, morale, and supply, aware that decisions would weigh heavily on those unseen in trenches below. Men adjusted their pace to the land, learning once again to yield to rhythm, rather than impose speed. The forest softened extremes of perception, teaching patience in every footfall and pause. Even brief moments of silence became profound, emphasizing endurance over action, reflection over motion. Diaries recorded the interplay between time, weather, and human experience, the subtle weight of waiting, and the fragile sense of preparedness. And beneath it all, the forest remained a patient observer, indifferent yet encompassing, shaping rhythm, motion, and reflection alike. By late December, the rhythm of waiting had become almost ceremonial, Soldiers moved, rested, wrote, and observed with deliberate care. Frost traced patterns across uniforms, helmets, and hands, a quiet reminder of continuity. Letters carried whispers of warmth, reassurance, and muted concern. Commanders weighed each decision, aware that the calm could break at any moment. That preparation was as vital as action. Men huddled in foxholes, adjusting gear and observing wind, snow, and ridge, attuned to subtle changes in environment. Even small tasks, securing a pack, shifting posture, breathing steadily, required attention and care. The forest absorbed all presence, patient and impartial, indifferent to stress yet shaping rhythm subtly. Every movement was deliberate, every breath intentional, every observation part of quiet endurance. And in this measured calm, the line waited beneath the frost-laden canopy, poised for the storm yet unseen. Night fell, stretching shadows across snow and timber, softening edges and deepening quiet. Soldiers settled in for rest where possible, mindful of warmth, distance, and presence. Letters were tucked away, diaries closed, packs adjusted, and boots rested on frozen earth. Commanders lingered over maps and reports, aware that even the calm carried potential danger. Men measured steps, breaths, and small gestures, conscious of rhythm, attention, and endurance. The forest embraced the quiet, its patient immensity blending with the line's stillness. Every ridge, hollow, and tree became a subtle guide for observation and persistence. The tension of the future lay just beyond perception, muted by snow and patience, yet present in every breath. Soldiers rested, moved, and reflected, integrating calm, awareness, and preparation. And beneath the long winter night, the forest held both men and expectation, waiting with them for what would inevitably come. December light grew pale, brushing across ridges and hollows, and soldiers felt the subtle shift in the world beyond their trees. News from the Ardennes began to filter down, carried in whispers, letters, and cautious reports, speaking of movement, fire, and anticipation. Men in the Hürtgen forest noted it quietly, aware that while the headlines had moved on, the forest's slow trial persisted. Frost clung to sleeves and packs, marking the rhythm of endurance in every step, every breath, every glance at a hollowed ridge. Diaries captured the quiet paradox. The world outside raced forward, yet here time felt paused, heavy and deliberate. Soldiers measured distance and patience, aware of both the physical and emotional terrain beneath boots and heart. Letters described cold, fatigue, and reflection, soft testaments to persistence in a place almost forgotten. The forest absorbed the subtle tension, holding both past and future within its patient observation. Every ridge and hollow became a quiet marker of endurance and memory. And beneath it all, men continued, unheralded, yet steadfast, shadows within a shadow. Reports arrived in small bundles, briefings condensed into careful lines on paper, speaking of Ardennes activity with urgency and expectation. Soldiers read, then reread, aware that the Hürtgen's trials were not yet concluded for them, though history's gaze had moved on. Frosted branches created tunnels of white silence, bending gently under snow's weight, sheltering both men and memory. The forest seemed almost self-aware, absorbing whispers and footsteps alike, offering neither judgment nor respite. Each day demanded patience, measured motion, and quiet observation, gestures of persistence that were invisible to the outside world. Men adjusted packs, tightened clothing, and exchanged low murmurs of caution and endurance. Diaries and letters recorded the passage of time, noting subtle shifts in weather, morale, and perception. Even the smallest gestures, lifting a boot, adjusting a scarf, observing a hollow, carried deliberate significance. Snow softened edges, obscured hazards, and created paths both inviting and treacherous. And through it all, the forest held its quiet dominion, patient and impartial, over every measured step. Movement continued, deliberate and slow, across ridges softened by frost and snow. Soldiers whispered warnings, exchanged observations, and noted the subtle rhythms of the forest as both guide and adversary. News of the Ardennes created tension without immediate effect, a distant storm, casting faint shadows over a quieter battlefield. Letters to home became quieter, more reflective, capturing endurance, reflection, and the muted rhythm of daily survival. Commanders reviewed maps in soft conversation, aware of uncertainty and limited influence over terrain, weather, and morale. Men in foxholes and trenches measured energy, warmth, and attention, adapting constantly to small shifts in environment. The forest seemed to breathe along with them, softening edges, absorbing noise, and shaping passage in subtle ways. Every ridge, every hollow, and every frozen branch became a teacher in patience and observation. Footsteps were deliberate, measured, and mindful, a rhythm shaped by frost, expectation, and endurance. And in this quiet persistence, the forest continued to witness the invisible trials of men left behind as the world moved forward. The weight of anticipation lay in soft patterns of snow, the silence thick with unspoken awareness. Soldiers observed subtle signs, wind direction, drifted snow, and the distant whisper of pines, all forming cues for careful movement. Reports from Ardennes lingered in memory and conversation, a quiet tension that threaded through daily life without immediate resolution. Diaries recorded fleeting impressions, observations of small triumphs, and the endurance required to navigate both terrain and expectation. Frost traced delicate patterns across gloves, helmets, and packs, a subtle reminder of constant adaptation and presence. Soldiers shared gestures of reassurance and instruction, soft voices carrying over the muted landscape. The forest absorbed sound, motion, and thought alike, patient and eternal in its observation. Every step was measured, every pause intentional, a meditation in motion and presence. Letters folded carefully, packs adjusted, and boots brushed lightly against frozen earth, all part of daily negotiation with circumstance. And through the haze of quiet anticipation, men endured, unnoticed yet unbroken. Snow softened ridges and hollows further, yet created new challenges, subtle and unspoken. Soldiers moved cautiously, aware that winter demanded respect as much as attention. Reports of Ardennes operations became distant echoes, shaping perception more than action, a ghostly rhythm influencing thought and decision. Diaries and letters reflected on endurance, solitude, and the subtle tension between action and waiting, awareness and anticipation. Men measured distance, breath, and movement, finding quiet harmony with both frost and forest. Every ridge, hollow, and fallen branch became a guide, every careful step a reflection of mindfulness and presence. The forest seemed to whisper in soft winds and falling snow, teaching patience without urgency. Soldiers rested when possible, sharing warmth and quiet conversation, conserving energy for days yet to come. Even silence carried weight, absorbing both tension and reflection in a way the outside world could not perceive. And beneath the muted white canopy, endurance continued, fragile yet resilient. Letters and diaries captured subtle shifts in awareness, small gestures of survival, and the quiet echo of forgotten battles. Soldiers adjusted clothing, packs, and attention with careful rhythm, learning again to negotiate both terrain and winter. The forest remained patient, absorbing all sound, motion, and thought without disturbance. Reports of Ardennes activity lingered at the edges of consciousness, shaping hope and concern simultaneously. Men shared whispered observations and instructions, soft guidance that reinforced both survival and presence. Frost traced paths over helmets, boots, and sleeves, gentle markers of time and endurance. Every ridge and hollow offered subtle instruction in patience, observation, and adaptation. Movement was deliberate, measured, and continuous, a rhythm informed by snow, wind, and forest alike. The forest's quiet dominion persisted, indifferent yet encompassing, teaching through presence alone, and as the day ended, men remained vigilant, poised within shadow, waiting for the storm to reach them. Evening softened the forest further, draping snow across trunks and branches in gentle weight. Soldiers rested in hollowed trenches, foxholes, or under timber, aware of both cold and the persistent rhythm of waiting. Letters were tucked away, diaries closed, and boots adjusted for warmth and stability. Commanders whispered low, deliberating over maps, aware that calm could break at any moment, and that patience was as vital as action. Men observed subtle shifts in snow, wind, and light, attuned to the soft pulse of forest life. Frost glimmered along edges, a reminder of continuity and endurance. Footsteps, words, and gestures were measured, small acts of deliberate mindfulness, woven into the day's rhythm. Diaries recorded attention, reflection, and preparation, noting the quiet endurance of those left behind. As the world moved forward, every ridge, hollow, and tree became both marker and teacher, shaping movement and thought. And beneath winter's patient canopy, the forest held both men and memory, silent witness to a quiet persistence on the edge of a new storm. The wind drifted softly through the forest, rustling pine needles, lifting snowflakes, and carrying whispers from hollow to ridge. Soldiers paused in trenches and foxholes, listening to the subtle rhythm of air moving across frozen ground. Fragments of letters, words spoken days ago, seemed to ride on gusts, mingling with sighs and muted orders, echoing without urgency. The forest transformed under winter's breath, its vast canopy breathing in harmony with the unseen currents. Diaries recorded observations, not of battle, but of presence, of wind, frost, and the subtle marks left by human endurance. Soldiers moved cautiously, aware that sound and silence alike were amplified in the hush of frost and timber. Every ridge, hollow, and fallen branch became a conduit for these echoes, a reminder of both continuity and fragility. Even the smallest gestures, adjusting a glove, shifting a pack, breathing deliberately, carried weight beneath this quiet music. The forest seemed to listen as much as it spoke, patient and impartial, holding every whisper within its vastness. And beneath the gentle swirl of air, men moved in measured rhythm, attuned to the subtle voice of the wind. Snow drifted in slow eddies, lifted by unseen currents, tracing patterns over boots, packs, and foxholes. Soldiers noted how sound bent and shifted, carrying low murmurs from comrades or distant hollows in strange clarity. Letters that had been read and reread seemed alive, their words echoing softly in the hush of frost and timber. The forest absorbed these sounds, amplifying some and silencing others, teaching lessons in attention and presence. Every ridge and hollow carried its own unique whisper, as if the wind remembered footsteps, gestures, and breath. Soldiers paused, listening for subtle shifts, the gentle sigh of air over snow and branch, the faint rustle of frozen leaves. Diaries recorded the rhythm, noting that patience and endurance were inseparable from observation and quiet reflection. Even silence became active, filled with the soft pulse of wind, carrying memory and presence alike. Small movements were deliberate, gestures soft in harmony with the forest's patient flow, and through it all, the wind seemed to carry both history and endurance, binding men, forest, and memory together. The chill of winter pressed softly against faces and hands, yet the wind was neither cruel nor insistent. Soldiers moved with awareness, observing how currents swirled around ridges and hollowed paths, how snow lifted and fell in gentle arcs. Fragments of voices, orders, and recollections seemed to ride invisible lines, weaving between trunks and branches. The forest responded in kind, bending, rustling, and exhaling, a quiet dialogue between presence and landscape. Diaries described the sensation of being both within and apart, aware that every gust carried both caution and reflection. Soldiers shared soft words, careful instructions, and brief exchanges, their voices harmonizing with wind, snow, and frozen earth. Every step was measured, each breath synchronized with subtle rhythms of frost-laden ground and shifting currents. The forest seemed to carry fragments of every action, gesture, and thought, holding them patiently, unjudging. Footsteps over snow created a quiet counterpoint to the wind's song, a rhythm of presence and endurance, and beneath the gentle movement of air, men moved with attentive calm, guided by both sound and reflection. Branches swayed with whispered insistence, releasing snow in soft showers that drifted slowly to the forest floor. Soldiers paused, sensing not only movement but intention, learning to observe the forest as companion and teacher. Letters that had been tucked away carried echoes in the mind, words seeming to rise with each breath of wind. The forest absorbed each sound, blending it into the larger rhythm of winter, where memory and present coexisted. Soldiers adjusted packs, gloves, and posture with quiet care, aware that every motion had resonance in this attentive silence. Diaries captured these nuances, noting that endurance and perception were intertwined, that survival relied on both patience and observation. Snow muffled edges, softened noise, and emphasized the subtle energy of gusts across frozen branches. Even silence became layered with movement, suggestion, and attention, teaching awareness without instruction. Each hollow ridge and frozen branch became a guide, a quiet participant in the dialogue of wind and presence. And in this soft orchestration, men continued their slow passage, attentive to rhythm, memory, and forest alike. Cold air carried more than frost. It carried memory, fragments of orders, and distant echoes of speech, once urgent but now softened. Soldiers moved with deliberate mindfulness, feeling the subtle pulse of the forest through wind, snow, and frozen ground. Diaries recorded this communion, a blending of presence, observation, and quiet reflection, of endurance made tangible through attention. Every ridge, hollow and branch became a marker of awareness, each movement a meditation in motion and rhythm. Letters felt alive again in this space, their words lifted on invisible currents, teaching patience, connection, and the persistence of memory. Soldiers spoke softly when needed, listening more than responding, their voices harmonizing with air, frost, and timber. Footsteps were slow, careful, and measured, each one creating resonance within snow and branch. Even the smallest gestures carried meaning, a shifted pack, a straightened glove, a steadied breath. The forest seemed to observe and absorb, patient and impartial, holding time and memory within its vastness. And beneath the soft exhalation of wind, men moved gently, carrying endurance and reflection as one. Snowflakes swirled in invisible eddies, forming gentle patterns that traced the path of each soldier. The wind lifted the faintest sound, whispering across hollowed ground, carrying impressions, orders, and memories alike. Diaries captured the sense of timelessness, the blending of history and moment, as the forest's soft breath intertwined with human presence. Soldiers paused in observation, listening to subtle changes in gusts, the movement of branches, and the weight of snow falling. Letters that had been read and reread seemed renewed, their words mingling with air and memory. The forest responded, bending and swaying, shaping subtle guidance through its patient presence. Every ridge, every hollow, every fallen branch became a conduit for awareness and endurance, teaching rhythm without insistence. Footsteps continued carefully, synchronized with the cadence of wind and frost-laden branches. Even silence was alive, carrying thought, reflection, and unspoken instruction across snow and timber. And through this gentle music of air, men remained attuned, present, and quietly persistent. Evening descended in soft gradients of grey snow reflecting the dim light, wind carrying fragments of memory across the forest. Soldiers settled in hollows, foxholes, and trenches, attentive to the whispering currents that threaded through trees and branches. Letters were folded and tucked away, diaries closed, boots rested, gloves adjusted, all movements deliberate and mindful. The forest absorbed each gesture, each step, each quiet breath, patient and impartial, holding both action and reflection. Soldiers shared brief whispers, careful instructions, and muted observations, harmonizing with wind, snow, and frozen earth. Frost glimmered on surfaces, tracing patterns that reminded men of continuity, time, and endurance. Every ridge, hollow, and branch became a participant in quiet instruction, guiding observation and measured motion. Steps were soft, deliberate, and attentive, synchronized with the rhythm of wind, snow, and patience. Even silence carried meaning, filled with subtle resonance and calm reflection. And beneath the gentle exhalation of air, men rested and moved in harmony with forest and wind, carrying memory forward with patient persistence. Night deepened, and the wind carried whispers across snow-laden ridges and hollowed ground. Soldiers moved carefully, attentive to the rhythm of gusts, the subtle voice of forest and frost, and the quiet pulse of memory. Diaries recorded observation, endurance, and reflection, noting that the war had become both lived and remembered in each breath and motion. Letters felt suspended in air, carried invisibly, connecting presence with the distant past and home. Every ridge, branch, and hollow became a quiet teacher, revealing rhythm, patience, and observation. Soldiers adjusted packs, boots, and breathing, mindful that even small gestures mattered in the attentive hush of winter. Snow drifted softly with each pulse of wind, forming a gentle symphony of movement, sound, and stillness. Silence carried weight, memory, and awareness, shaping rhythm and thought as surely as any spoken order. Every motion, every pause, every breath blended with the forest's patient exhalation, and beneath the soft, encompassing voice of wind, men moved, listened, and endured, the forest and memory intertwined. Winter deepened across the forest, carrying a frost that settled in boots, gloves, and bones, softening the landscape yet sharpening awareness. German lines, once rigid and purposeful, began to yield under pressure, retreating like shadows dissolving in pale light. Soldiers on both sides felt the weight of exhaustion, a rhythm of steps measured by cold, fatigue, and enduring focus. Orders traveled through snow and silence, sometimes reaching their destinations only in fragments, carrying intention yet losing clarity. Diaries recorded muted perseverance, noting the subtle erosion of certainty alongside the persistence of duty. The forest absorbed the slow collapse, its pines bending under frost, as if in quiet acknowledgement. Men adjusted to the rhythm of retreat and advance, sensing change in air, snow, and ridge. Even small gestures, lifting a boot, shifting a pack, tightening gloves, became acts of presence and care. Each step over frozen earth carried memory, responsibility, and quiet endurance. And beneath it all, the forest held witness, patient and impartial, to the slow dissolution of lines and ideals. Snow drifted across foxholes and hollowed ground, softening edges, masking hazards, and demanding careful attention. Soldiers observed changes in the rhythm of movement, noting that German resistance, though fading, persisted in careful, deliberate patterns. Frost traced lines along helmets, packs, and gloves, a quiet reminder of endurance in the midst of fatigue. Letters and diaries recorded subtle shifts in awareness, noting that both sides moved with shadows of former strength, guided more by instinct than command. The forest absorbed every sound, whisper, and step, indifferent yet encompassing, holding memory alongside present movement. Men moved slowly, balancing presence with observation, aware that each ridge or hollow could shift strategy and expectation. Even silence carried weight, resonating with the fading echoes of orders, the memory of plans, and the persistent rhythm of endurance. Every step became a meditation in patience, survival, and reflection, a quiet acknowledgement of inevitability. And beneath the soft fall of snow and frost-laden trees, the forest bore witness to the final deliberate movements of a faltering defense. Branches bent under snow, forming tunnels of muted light and shadow, guiding movement without interference. Soldiers adjusted posture and rhythm, breathing in careful cadence with the soft murmur of wind through pines. Orders continued to travel along ridges and hollows, fragmented yet carrying the lingering intention of authority. Diaries and letters captured the quiet persistence of both fatigue and observation, noting that resistance was as much psychological as physical. The forest's patient stillness absorbed subtle movements, allowing men to measure each step against both terrain and endurance. Frost-coated uniforms and gear reminded soldiers of the ongoing trial, the long effort required to navigate both physical and emotional landscape. Even minor gestures, shifting a pack, straightening a glove, stepping over ice-laden route, became meaningful within the rhythm of slow progress. Men moved with careful observation, aware that each hollow and ridge held both challenge and instruction. Snow-muffled sound, shaping rhythm and presence, marking the persistence of endurance against retreating lines. And through it all, the forest watched quietly, impartial, yet attentive, chronicling the slow collapse of German order. The line advanced incrementally, each step deliberate, measured by frost, fatigue, and the subtle pulse of terrain. Soldiers noted the difference between earlier resistance and the present, where defiance lingered more in ritual than in effectiveness. Diaries recorded the sensation of enduring ghosts, the persistence of memory, and the strange quiet that accompanied slow surrender. Branches swayed gently under the weight of snow, their movement echoing the slow unraveling of organized defense. Men adjusted to the rhythm of expectation and inevitability, moving deliberately while observing ridge, hollow, and frozen ground. Letters spoke softly of endurance and connection, bridging the present struggle with distant memory and hope. The forest absorbed every gesture, breath, and sound, shaping awareness through subtle guidance and quiet observation. Footsteps were soft, deliberate, and synchronized with wind, frost, and terrain. Every ridge and hollow offered instruction in patience, observation, and measured persistence. And beneath the snow-laden canopy, the forest held both soldiers and memory, marking the final quiet resistance of those who remained. Snow softened ridges, while revealing hidden hollows, demanding caution and attention. Soldiers measured each step against terrain and fatigue, aware that movement was guided as much by instinct as by command. German resistance, though diminished, lingered like echoes of an earlier storm, persistent yet fading under the weight of time and endurance. Diaries and letters recorded subtle rhythms, the pulse of breath, the soft murmur of wind, the sway of branches under snow, markers of presence and observation. Men moved carefully, adjusting packs, boots, and gloves with deliberate rhythm, aware that each gesture carried significance. The forest's patience seemed infinite, absorbing both fatigue and attention, guiding observation without demand. Even silence was instructive, holding memory, awareness, and quiet instruction within its folds. Every hollow ridge and branch became a subtle teacher of patience and presence, shaping endurance as surely as orders once shaped movement. Footsteps were soft, deliberate, a rhythm of survival and reflection in a landscape of fading resistance. And through this quiet persistence, the forest marked the slow dissolution of the last organized stand. Frost clung to uniforms, packs, and rifles, delicate tracery marking every ridge and movement. Soldiers observed subtle shifts in snow, wind, and hollowed ground, sensing the quiet erosion of resistance. Orders traveled faintly, sometimes lost, sometimes refracted through distance and fatigue, carrying the residue of intention rather than action. Diaries captured the paradox of movement and stillness, advance and retreat, presence and observation. The forest absorbed every motion, every breath, teaching endurance without insistence. Men moved with deliberation, careful to preserve energy and attention, attuned to both landscape and subtle rhythm of wind and snow. Even minor gestures became meditative, shifting a pack, stepping over a frozen route, adjusting gloves against frost. Letters offered solace, connection, and the gentle acknowledgement of shared experience. Snow softened sound and edges, yet revealed subtle challenges, highlighting awareness as much as endurance. And beneath the patient canopy, the forest held both memory and presence, witnessing the quiet fade of German lines. The pale winter light shifted softly across hollow and ridge, illuminating the slow rhythm of movement. Soldiers paused to adjust posture, breath, and gear, measuring motion against fatigue and terrain. Resistance lingered in fragmented patterns, fading yet persistent, like echoes in hollowed ground. Diaries recorded this persistence, noting the endurance required to move, observe, and continue in the quiet unraveling of defense. Frost-laden branches whispered softly in wind, tracing patterns that mirrored both motion and reflection. Men measured every step, every pause, every adjustment, guided by presence and observation. Even silence carried instruction, layering memory, awareness, and subtle endurance across the forest floor. The snow absorbed minor sounds, shaping rhythm and marking each careful passage. Every ridge and hollow offered subtle cues, teaching patience and measured progress. And through it all, the forest witnessed the Germans' last stand, patient and impartial, as lines dissolved beneath snow and wind. Evening fell, pale and gentle, casting muted grey across snow and timber. Soldiers settled briefly in hollows, foxholes, or behind ridges, breathing slowly, adjusting gloves and packs, attuned to rhythm, wind, and snow. Orders were faint and fragmented, yet carried meaning through deliberate movement and awareness. Diaries recorded subtle attention to terrain, fatigue, and the soft persistence of both advance and withdrawal. The forest held all sound and presence, patient and impartial, teaching endurance in observation and reflection. Footsteps, whispers, and breath moved in careful harmony with wind, frost, and hollowed ground. Small gestures, a shifted pack, adjusted glove, steadied boot, became markers of presence and mindfulness. Snow drifted lightly in the wind, shaping sound and perception, emphasizing rhythm over haste. Every ridge, hollow, and branch became both guide and witness, shaping movement through quiet observation. And beneath the long winter night, the forest bore silent witness to endurance, memory, and the slow, inevitable fade of German resistance. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the American line advanced, each step deliberate, measured against snow, mud, and frozen earth. The long endurance of months pressed on every shoulder, foot, and gloved hand. Yet there was movement now, subtle yet unmistakable. Soldiers noted the shift in air, the soft change in wind across ridges and hollows, as if the forest itself had acknowledged the passage. Diaries captured quiet triumph, not in glory, but in the endurance that had brought men to this point. Letters folded carefully into packs carried words of reflection, both pride and sorrow intertwined, each sentence a tether to the life and world beyond the trees. Even small gestures, adjusting a boot, straightening a sleeve, steadying breath, carried weight in this long-awaited moment. The green wall, once unyielding, yielded incrementally, revealing hollowed ground and broken branches beneath the snow. Footsteps moved with careful rhythm, awareness, and lingering caution. Every ridge and hollow, a quiet teacher in persistence. Frost traced delicate lines across uniforms and packs, marking endurance more than advance. And beneath the soft exhalation of wind, men pressed onward, carrying both sorrow and presence in measured motion. Snow drifted in slow, deliberate eddies, carrying whispers of orders, observation, and cautious encouragement. Soldiers moved in patterns, learned over months, steps synchronized with terrain, frost, and quiet observation. Diaries recorded that each advance was tempered by reflection, by memory of absence, by awareness of what had been left behind. The forest, patient and impartial, absorbed sound and motion, shaping perception and pace without interference. Men observed subtle changes in ridge, hollow, and branch, learning from the quiet instructions of terrain and endurance. Letters were reread and tucked away, words reminding men of persistence, survival, and human presence amid frozen quiet. Every step was measured, every breath deliberate, every glance attentive to both past and present. Even silence carried weight, echoing memory and guiding thought. Footfalls on snow created a soft rhythm, marking passage and presence more than conquest, and beneath the slowly yielding canopy, the forest bore witness to the measured breaking of the green wall. Branches swayed gently, releasing snow in quiet arcs that softened edges and muffled motion. Soldiers adjusted posture and gear, gloved hands tracing careful lines, boots shifting in rhythm with terrain. Orders moved in fragments through hollowed ridges, carrying intent and guidance without urgency, shaping the advance with subtle insistence. Diaries reflected on the paradox: survival achieved through exhaustion, triumph through endurance, victory tempered by reflection. Frost traced delicate geometry along uniforms, packs, and boots, a quiet map of effort, time, and persistence. Men paused at hollowed ground and frozen ridges, listening to wind, observing snow, sensing subtle changes in pressure and slope. Even the smallest gestures, tightening gloves, straightening a strap, exhaling slowly, held meaning within the rhythm of advance and observation. Letters whispered memory and connection, folding reflection into the cadence of measured steps. Snow softened sound, emphasizing awareness and persistence more than movement. And through it all, the forest continued to hold both action and reflection in its patient, unyielding quiet. The line crept forward, hollow by ridge, frost-laden branch by frozen root, each advance deliberate and reverent. Soldiers moved with awareness of both distance covered and distance yet to come, noting every subtle shift in the landscape. Diaries recorded endurance and observation, capturing that each ridge gained carried both relief and remembrance. The forest absorbed every gesture, breath and footstep, shaping motion and attention in quiet, unobtrusive instruction. Soldiers measured rhythm and pause, aware that even the softest movement resonated across snow and timber. Letters tucked into packs carried warmth, memory and reflection, quiet companions in frozen passage. Every ridge and hollow offered instruction, a patient teacher of persistence and care. Frost traced lines along boots and gloves, silent testimony to passage and presence. Footsteps were measured, deliberate, synchronized with wind and snow, carrying reflection as much as motion. And beneath the yielding trees, the green wall softened, not with triumph alone, but with the quiet persistence of men who had endured. Snow softened edges, while revealing hollowed paths, guiding measured movement without insistence. Soldiers observed changes, subtle and profound, in wind, frost, and hollowed ground, adapting with care and mindfulness. The forest seemed alive in this exchange, teaching rhythm and observation without voice or instruction. Diaries captured the paradox of endurance, advance measured in feet, victory measured in presence, and triumph measured in survival. Gloves, packs, and boots were adjusted with deliberate care, each motion a small meditation in patience and awareness. Letters reread and tucked away reminded men of memory, distance, and the persistence of human connection. Every ridge and hollow became a point of observation, a silent guide through both terrain and reflection. Footsteps were slow, careful, and deliberate, synchronized with wind, frost, and forest alike. Even silence carried instruction, emphasizing rhythm, endurance, and presence over haste or display. And as the line pushed through, the green wall began to dissolve, leaving in its wake a quiet, infinite hush. Branches bent under snow's gentle weight, forming muted corridors of shadow and pale light. Soldiers advanced with awareness, synchronized breath, and careful footing guiding movement along hollowed paths. Orders traveled faintly, carried by fragments and echoes, shaping intent more than action, guiding awareness more than motion. Diaries reflected on the merging of effort, endurance, and reflection, noting that survival demanded attention as much as energy. Frost traced delicate lines along uniforms and boots, silent witnesses to presence and persistence. Men paused at ridges and hollows, listening to subtle currents in wind and snow, adjusting motion and posture with quiet mindfulness. Even minor gestures became meditation, conscious acts of rhythm and care. Letters offered memory, warmth, and reflection, reminders of connection and endurance beyond the forest. Footsteps moved softly across snow, each step resonating with awareness and care. And beneath the slowly retreating canopy, the green wall crumbled, leaving a quiet, almost infinite space in its place. Light shifted slowly across snow and frost, pale and deliberate, marking passage through hollow and ridge. Soldiers adjusted posture, gloves and packs, attentive to wind, snow, and subtle shifts in terrain. Resistance faded in careful measured increments, leaving hollowed paths and fractured lines beneath patient trees. Diaries recorded subtle triumph, tempered by reflection, noting that survival often outlasted glory. The forest exhaled softly, carrying whispers of wind, frost, and memory, guiding steps and thought alike. Men moved deliberately, aware that each hollow, ridge, and branch held instruction in patience and observation. Even silence carried weight, soft echoes of endurance and reflection threading through snow and timber. Footsteps were synchronized with breath, wind, and frozen ground, creating a rhythm of careful progress. Frost traced patterns of passage, documenting presence, awareness, and continuity, and through the soft hush of air and snow, the Americans moved forward, the green wall yielding slowly beneath patient, watchful trees. Night descended gently, pale across snow and timber, carrying the quiet residue of advance. Soldiers settled briefly in hollows and behind ridges, breathing slowly, adjusting gloves, boots, and packs, mindful of rhythm, wind, and frost. Orders were faint and fragmentary, guiding with intent more than command, shaping presence over motion. Diaries recorded endurance, reflection, and subtle triumph, noting that survival defined victory as much as territory. The forest held all sound and movement, patient and impartial, guiding attention and presence without insistence. Footsteps, whispers, and breath moved in harmony with wind, frost, and hollowed ground. Minor gestures, shifted pack, steadied boot, straightened glove, became meaningful markers of awareness and care. Snow drifted softly, shaping rhythm, presence, and attention, emphasizing awareness over haste. Every ridge and hollow became a teacher of observation, patience, and persistence, silently guiding men through yielding ground. And beneath the vast patient canopy, the green wall lay broken, leaving a hushed, infinite silence as both witness and teacher. The forest held its quiet as men moved slowly among hollowed paths and frost-laden ridges, counting what remained of units once vibrant and whole. Names recorded in diaries, letters folded in packs, and whispered recollections became markers of absence as much as presence. Footsteps were hesitant, aware that each ridge and hollow carried the imprint of what had been endured and lost. Soldiers paused to trace patterns in snow, noticing how frost and wind preserved memory more than map or report could. Regiments once numbered in thousands now existed in fragmented rows, scattered across hollowed ground and frozen ridges. Diaries recorded both numbers and reflections, noting that survival came at a weight far heavier than the advance itself. Soldiers spoke softly of absence, of comrades remembered in movement, breath, and gesture, rather than in voice or rank. Even the forest seemed to pause, patient and impartial, holding the measure of loss alongside enduring trees. Letters carried memories of faces, laughter, and fear, now suspended quietly in snow and wind. And beneath the soft exhalation of the forest, men moved with awareness of what was gone, tracing absence as carefully as presence. Branches bent under snow, forming corridors through which soldiers moved, counting and noting absence in careful, reflective rhythm. The forest absorbed the movement, neither judging nor interfering, holding memory within frozen hollow and ridge. Diaries described the erosion of order, the disappearance of regiments, and the persistence of presence despite fragmented numbers. Soldiers traced footprints, adjusted gloves and packs, and exhaled slowly, marking each moment with quiet reverence. Names whispered in letters or remembered in conversation seemed to linger in the wind, carried along hollowed paths and frozen ground. Frost traced delicate lines along boots and uniforms, silent witnesses to both effort and absence. Even small gestures, shifting a pack, steadying a step, adjusting a glove, became markers of remembrance and care. Every ridge and hollow seemed to echo the absence of what had been, teaching reflection in movement. Footsteps created a rhythm of observation, awareness, and endurance, more than forward motion, and beneath the soft, pale light, men continued, aware of the infinite quiet that stretched across what had been lost. Snow drifted gently across hollowed ground, softening edges, while amplifying the sense of emptiness left in the forest's wake. Soldiers paused in hollows and behind ridges, tracing what remained of formations, noting what had survived and what had vanished. Diaries recorded absence alongside endurance, reflecting on the subtle boundary between persistence and self-destruction. Names were spoken softly, letters reread, gestures remembered in thought rather than action. The forest seemed to breathe with these memories, patient and impartial, teaching awareness through silence and presence. Frost clung to boots, gloves, and packs, delicate tracery, marking the rhythm of passage and endurance. Footsteps were measured, deliberate, synchronized with wind, snow, and hollow, each step a meditation in observation and reflection. Even the soft exhalation of breath carried weight, awareness, and remembrance. Every ridge and hollow became a quiet teacher of persistence, memory, and the delicate balance between survival and ruin. And beneath the soft white light, men moved among absence and presence alike, tracing what had been lost with careful attention. The line of soldiers advanced slowly, mindful of hollowed ground and subtle ridges, measuring loss against endurance. Diaries recorded the numbers, thousands diminished, units fragmented, and identities quietly erased, yet noted that attention, presence, and observation persisted. The forest absorbed every movement, every breath, every gesture, impartial yet attuned to the rhythm of absence. Soldiers traced the subtle marks of previous paths in snow, careful not to disturb fragile memory. Letters whispered stories of courage, fatigue, and quiet hope, suspended now in frost and wind. Every small gesture, adjusting gloves, steadying boots, shifting packs, became an acknowledgement of endurance and loss. Footsteps traced deliberate paths, each one reflecting rhythm, reflection, and the subtle imprint of absence. The forest seemed to hold both memory and presence, recording endurance alongside erasure. Snow softened sound, emphasizing thought and awareness more than motion or gain. And beneath the patient canopy, men moved slowly, tracing absence with care and quiet reverence. Branches swayed softly under snow's weight, releasing gentle flurries that carried memory across hollow and ridge. Soldiers paused to note shifts in air, frost, and terrain, aware that the quiet revealed as much as the advance ever had. Diaries recorded the slow counting of units lost, names faded or whispered, each absence resonating through hollowed paths. Letters tucked away carried memory, reflection, and connection, offering guidance beyond command or order. Frost outlined boots, gloves, and packs, delicate tracery echoing both passage and endurance. Even minor gestures, straightening a sleeve, adjusting a strap, steadying a step, held meaning in the rhythm of observation and remembrance. Footsteps moved with deliberate softness, synchronized with wind, snow, and hollowed ground, creating rhythm in absence. Every ridge and hollow became a teacher, guiding awareness and attention without insistence. The forest seemed to inhale with memory, patient and impartial, holding absence alongside endurance. And beneath the pale winter light, men continued, attentive to what had been lost, as carefully as to what remained. Snow softened sound and edges, carrying whispers of letters, diaries, and memory across hollowed ground. Soldiers measured every step against fatigue, frost, and absence, noting how loss had reshaped both terrain and spirit. Diaries reflected on the paradox of endurance. Survival required persistence, yet persistence exacted a silent toll. Names spoken in quiet gestures remembered in thought, and letters reread became companions through hollowed ridges. Frost traced delicate lines across boots, gloves, and packs, preserving passage and memory simultaneously. Even small adjustments, a shifted pack, a deep breath, a steadied boot, carried meaning in rhythm and observation. Footsteps were soft, deliberate, measured against wind, snow, and terrain, each step marking both presence and absence. Every hollow and ridge became a quiet guide, shaping awareness, reflection, and endurance. The forest seemed patient yet attentive, holding the measure of loss alongside silent observation. And beneath the soft grey light, men continued, tracing absence with reverent, deliberate attention. Branches bent and swayed, letting drifted snow fall, like gentle whispers over frozen ground. Soldiers moved carefully, mindful of hollowed ridges, subtle shifts in terrain, and the echo of what had been endured and lost. Diaries recorded numbers, reflections, and fragmented identities, noting that survival required presence more than movement. Letters quietly reread, whispered stories of courage, endurance, and connection beyond the immediate forest. Frost traced patterns along gloves, boots, and packs, silent markers of effort, observation, and reflection. Small gestures became meditative, a straightened strap, a steadied foot, a deliberate breath in rhythm with snow and wind. Footsteps traced measured patterns, each one marking passage through absence and presence, guiding awareness more than progress. Every ridge, hollow and branch, seemed to offer instruction in patience, reflection, and quiet endurance. The forest absorbed each gesture and sound, impartial yet attentive, recording the quiet tally of loss. And beneath the pale winter sky, men moved slowly, tracing the count of the lost with deliberate care and reverence. Snow drifted in delicate arcs, softening edges while revealing hollowed paths that had been carved by months of endurance. Soldiers paused in quiet observation, noting the absence of former comrades and the subtle traces of what had passed. Diaries recorded the fragility of memory alongside persistence, reflecting on the thin line between survival and quiet destruction. Names whispered in letters and recollections floated softly in wind, carrying connection, presence, and reflection through hollowed ground. Frost etched delicate lines on uniforms, boots, and packs, preserving both passage and effort. Every small movement, shifting a pack, adjusting gloves, steadying breath, became meditation, a gentle acknowledgement of endurance and loss. Footsteps moved softly, synchronized with the rhythm of wind, snow, and hollow, marking presence in absence. The forest seemed to listen and remember, patient and impartial, holding both memory and endurance in balance. Every ridge and hollow offered quiet instruction, shaping awareness through reflection and subtle observation. And beneath the soft drifting snow, men moved with reverent attention, tracing the infinite measure of what had been lost. The forest breathed in quiet rhythms once again, the soft murmur of wind threading through pines and hollows where months before only tension had lived. Moss crept over broken helmets and fragments of wire, embracing the earth with gentle patience, covering the traces of human presence while allowing memory to linger. Birds returned in hesitant flocks, weaving their song through hollowed ground and frost-softened ridges. Locals wandered slowly, noting hollow paths beneath trees, adjusting to the rhythm of regrowth and sensing the silent history beneath their feet. Diaries left behind or rediscovered recorded small reflections of survival and endurance, the faintest traces of human voices among branches and roots. Footsteps fell lightly on snow-melted paths, careful not to disturb what had begun to settle into quiet stillness. Trees bent softly under wind and sun, stretching toward light and carrying the weight of seasons past and seasons to come. Even small gestures of returning life, sprigs of grass through mud, birds in distant hollows, the soft scent of pine resin, carried memory and renewal in equal measure. soldiers' remnants, discarded equipment, and the faint imprint of human rhythm rested beneath snow, root, and soil, observed silently by the patient forest, and beneath the gentle hum of wind and growth, the forest whispered its own quiet testimony to endurance and return. The hollowed paths, once etched with the rhythm of orders and movement, now carried only the soft rustle of leaves and undergrowth. Helmets and fragments of wire glimmered faintly beneath moss, delicate reminders of human presence layered over by Earth's patient reclamation. Locals returned to clear paths, rebuild homes, and listen to the wind through pines, their steps slow, reflective, and deliberate. Diaries and letters tucked into boxes or buried in memory surfaced occasionally, offering quiet glimpses into endurance, observation, and subtle triumph. The forest seemed to hold all history gently, absorbing sound, scent, and presence without insistence, guiding observation in quiet. Branches swayed under gentle wind, releasing the faintest cascade of needles and snow remnants into hollowed hollows and ridges. Birds sang in renewed rhythm, their notes threading through timber, moss, and soil, stitching continuity between loss and persistence. Even frost on roots and the soft dampness of soil whispered memory, shaping reflection more than motion. Footsteps were light, careful, aware of both presence and what lay beneath in soft, unyielding silence. And through it all the forest breathed patient and watchful, holding both human history and renewal in delicate balance. Grass sprouted in hollowed trenches, brushing gently against discarded fragments of wire and iron. Locals paused to notice the moss growing thick over metal and soil. Tracing history with quiet observation, diaries occasionally surfaced tucked in boxes, attics, or old packs, offering stories of endurance, persistence, and reflection on the forest's enduring patience. Soldiers' presence was felt in hollowed ground, in frozen ridges now softened, in subtle depressions overgrown with green. Trees bent and swayed, shadows brushing paths once carved with precise movement and careful observation. Birds and small animals returned, threading new life through branches and hollows, restoring rhythm and delicate sound to the quiet forest. Even small gestures of human movement, brushing moss aside, tracing a hollowed root, pausing in reflection, carried awareness of what had endured. Footsteps fell softly across thawed soil, mindful of memory and continuation alike. Snow left in small patches melted slowly, feeding the roots and reflecting pale light across the forest floor. And beneath it all the forest held quiet testimony to return, renewal, and the gentle persistence of life after upheaval. Roots intertwined with fragments of helmet and wire, forming natural mosaics of memory and reclamation. Locals moved slowly, touching trees, brushing snow from fallen branches, noting hollowed ridges where months before only soldiers had tread. Diaries and letters occasionally surfaced, marking endurance, presence, and reflection. Whispering faintly through hollow and root, the forest carried the soft rhythm of wind and growth, patient and impartial, observing human gestures and returning life alike. Frost traced delicate lines along root, branch, and moss, shaping silent patterns across hollowed ground. Birds, small animals, and insects threaded movement through the forest, weaving a quiet soundtrack of life in place of lost voices. Even minor human gestures, a pack shifted, a boot lifted carefully, a breath exhaled slowly, held meaning in rhythm and observation. Footsteps were quiet, deliberate, and attuned to subtle shifts in snow, moss, and hollow. Every ridge and hollow offered instruction in observation, patience, and gentle remembrance, and beneath soft light filtering through winter-bent branches, the forest carried both human memory and Earth's quiet renewal. Moss thickened over hollowed ground, softening the imprint of what had been endured. Locals paused to observe the delicate balance of renewal and memory, tracing paths where soldiers had once walked. Diaries, letters, and fragments of recorded observation offered glimpses of presence, endurance, and human rhythm. Branches swayed, snow and needles, releasing in gentle arcs, carrying history into soil and root. Birds threaded air with song, weaving continuity between absence and return. Even the faint scent of pine resin carried memory, linking presence and persistence in subtle, quiet threads. Frost traced delicate filigree along boots, branches, and roots, silent markers of passage, both human and natural. Small gestures, brushing moss aside, pausing at hollowed ridges, exhaling slowly, echoed in the rhythm of observation and reflection. Footsteps fell softly on thawing soil, careful not to disturb both renewal and memory intertwined beneath. And beneath the patient forest canopy, life continued to reclaim, record, and remember in equal measure. The river whispered softly through hollowed banks, carrying melted snow and fallen needles downstream. Locals adjusted to the rhythm of returning life, observing moss, frost, and hollowed ground with slow, deliberate attention. Diaries and letters occasionally emerged, testaments of endurance, reflection, and human presence bridging past and present. Trees bent and swayed gently, shadows stretching over ridges and roots where soldiers had once paused, breathed, and moved. Birds sang quietly, threading song through hollowed paths and softened ridges, marking return and persistence. Even the soft exhalation of wind seemed attentive, carrying fragments of memory, awareness, and renewal alike. Frost traced delicate lines along roots, moss, and fallen debris, silent witnesses to passage and return. Minor gestures of human care, touching a branch, shifting a boot, tracing a path, resonated with awareness, reflection, and reverence. Footsteps fell in deliberate rhythm, careful to preserve memory while embracing renewal. And beneath pale sunlight filtering through patient trees, the forest carried all, endurance, loss, and the gentle reclamation of life. Hollows softened under the gentle weight of melting snow, carrying subtle patterns of human and natural rhythm alike. Locals walked slowly, observing moss roots and remnants of helmet or wire, their steps threaded with awareness and reflection. Diaries, letters, and whispers of endurance echoed faintly, blending with wind, frost, and renewed life. Trees swayed, releasing snow, needles, and light into hollowed ground, shaping quiet instruction through rhythm rather than command. Birds, insects, and small animals moved in patterns both careful and instinctive, restoring soft sound to previously muted paths. Frost traced delicate lines across branches, moss, and root, holding memory alongside Earth's quiet renewal. Even small human gestures, adjusting gloves, tracing hollowed paths, pausing in attention, carried reflection and presence. Footsteps fell gently, synchronized with wind, thawing soil, and the rhythm of returning life. Every ridge, hollow, and branch offered instruction in observation, patience, and the slow reclamation of memory. And beneath the patient forest canopy, the earth held quiet witness to life's return, memory's persistence, and the gentle healing of all that had passed. Light shifted softly through the treetops, pale and deliberate, illuminating moss, hollowed ground, and fragments of human presence alike. Locals moved in quiet rhythm, adjusting steps to fragile terrain, observing frost, roots, and fallen debris. Diaries and letters surfaced occasionally, bridging absence and return, endurance and reflection. Branches swayed, shadows brushed ridges and hollows, releasing snow, needles, and light across the forest floor. Birds threaded song through hollowed paths, restoring soft rhythm and presence to spaces once marked by movement, tension, and endurance. Frost traced delicate filigree along root, branch, and moss, preserving the quiet story of passage. Even minor gestures, brushing snow aside, touching moss, pausing in breath, carried reflection, awareness, and reverence. Footsteps fell gently on softened ground, careful to honor memory while embracing renewal. Every ridge, hollow, and root became teacher and witness, offering instruction in patience, presence, and quiet observation. And beneath the patient, recovering forest, life hummed softly, once again, blending memory, endurance, and gentle reclamation into the rhythm of ongoing existence. The forest now hummed with quiet life, leaves brushing softly against each other as wind drifted through hollowed ridges. Veterans walked slowly along paths they had once known in snow and frost, their steps careful, deliberate, and reflective. Moss clung to roots and fallen branches, softening the ground beneath boots and shoes alike, a gentle cushion for both memory and presence. Memorials rose quietly among trees etched with names and dates, silent guardians of human endurance and absence. Diaries and letters, preserved in museums or attics, whispered their stories through glass and paper, connecting visitors to voices long past. Even the forest seemed aware of reverence, guiding thought without insistence, shaping observation in subtle arcs of light and shadow. Birds moved freely among branches, their song delicate, carrying both life and remembrance across hollowed ground. Veterans paused to touch moss, smooth engraved stone, or trace a route that had endured decades of quiet reclamation. Each step threaded memory, presence, and reflection into the forest's living rhythm, and beneath the patient canopy, the forest held both absence and endurance, with gentle, unspoken reverence. Leaves whispered softly as wind brushed through branches, threading hollowed ground with gentle sound. Veterans moved slowly, pausing at memorials and moss-covered roots, tracing paths that had long been transformed by time and nature. Museums offered glimpses of letters, photographs, and diaries, preserving fragments of human endurance and presence for those who came later. The forest responded with quiet rhythm, shaping awareness through light, shadow, and subtle movement of air. Birds sang lightly, filling space once dominated by tension and endurance with soft music of continuity and presence. Frost and moss marked roots and stones, delicate lines of memory alongside signs of natural reclamation. Even the smallest gestures, pausing, touching, exhaling slowly, carried reverence for both history and living presence. Footsteps fell gently across softened ground, mindful of memory threaded through hollowed ridges and paths. Every ridge, hollow, and branch seemed to hold story, endurance, and reflection simultaneously. And beneath the patient green canopy, presence and memory coexisted in quiet, gentle harmony. Sunlight shifted through high branches, casting pale warmth over moss, roots, and memorial stones. Veterans lingered, tracing inscriptions with gloved or bare hands, reading names carried decades through paper, memory, and wind. Diaries preserved in quiet rooms told stories of endurance, observation, and subtle triumph, each word a bridge between past and present. The forest absorbed each pause and movement, impartial yet attentive, carrying both memory and renewal. Birds and small animals threaded their lives through hollowed paths, singing life into spaces once dominated by human persistence and struggle. Frost and dew traced delicate lines along moss and roots, marking decades of quiet reclamation and observation. Even minor gestures, brushing a fallen needle aside, adjusting a jacket, or inhaling deeply, became acts of presence, observation, and remembrance. Footsteps fell softly, measured in rhythm with the wind and rustle of leaves. Every hollowed ridge, every fallen branch, every stone seemed to carry quiet instruction in patience, endurance, and reflection. And beneath gentle light, filtering through patient trees, the forest held memory, life, and reverence together seamlessly. The paths, once hollowed by soldiers' boots and packs, now carried gentle steps of return, reflection, and soft observation. Veterans paused at moss-covered ridges, tracing hollowed ground with attentive eyes, noting both absence and enduring presence. Museums displayed diaries, letters, and personal effects, each fragment a bridge connecting living visitors with voices that had once moved through the forest. The wind moved quietly, threading sound through branches and hollowed ground, carrying memory in its soft exhalation. Birds traced slow arcs through air, threading life and song into the rhythm of roots, moss, and softened earth. Frost clung delicately to branches and memorial stones, preserving both passage and reflection across seasons and decades. Even the softest gestures, resting a hand on stone, tracing moss, exhaling slowly, carried weight in rhythm, observation, and remembrance. Footsteps fell with quiet deliberation, careful to respect hollowed paths, ridges, and centuries of quiet endurance. Every ridge, root, and hollow seemed to hold a story, an echo, a memory, and a presence simultaneously. And beneath the enduring canopy, the forest exhaled softly, attentive to human reverence and natural renewal alike. Light shifted slowly across moss and roots, pale and deliberate, illuminating memorials and hollowed paths alike. Veterans moved through hollowed ground with gentle steps, observing remnants of past endurance in moss, stone, and hollowed ridges. Diaries and letters preserved carefully, whispered stories of observation, reflection, and persistence, connecting living presence to memory. Birds moved freely, threading song through hollowed ground, weaving life into spaces once shaped by tension, endurance, and absence. Frost traced delicate patterns along roots, moss, and fallen branches, quiet witness to the rhythm of human and natural passage alike. Even minor gestures, brushing moss aside, pausing at stones, inhaling gently, became acts of reverence and observation. Footsteps traced measured paths, soft against thawed soil, each step bridging past and present with quiet mindfulness. Every ridge, hollow, and branch carried instruction in patience, endurance, and reflection, simultaneously alive and remembered. The forest exhaled softly, threading memory and life together in quiet, attentive rhythm. And beneath high, patient trees, presence and remembrance coexisted, alive in sound, breath, and gentle motion. Branches swayed with the wind, carrying whispers through hollowed ridges and moss-draped roots. Veterans lingered at memorials, tracing inscriptions and moss with gloved hands, threading past into present. Museums preserved diaries, letters, and artifacts, quiet witnesses to endurance, reflection, and memory. Birds traced gentle arcs through air, carrying soft song across hollowed ground and softened ridges. Frost traced delicate lines along stones, roots, and branches, preserving subtle memory alongside renewal. Even the softest human gesture, a pause, a hand tracing stone or moss, a deep breath, carried reverence and reflection. Footsteps fell lightly across soil and softened paths, mindful of memory layered beneath the surface. Every ridge, hollow, and root seemed to hold continuity, endurance, and quiet instruction in observation. The forest, patient and watchful, seemed to exhale memory with every whisper of wind and motion of branch. And beneath the gentle canopy, Echoes of the past resonated softly, carried in rhythm, presence, and quiet reverence. Sunlight filtered through high branches, painting soft gold across moss, memorials, and hollowed ground. Veterans walked slowly, pausing to observe roots, stones, and fallen branches with reflective attention. Diaries, letters, and photographs, preserved carefully in museums or attics, whispered enduring stories of observation, persistence, and presence. The forest absorbed all movement and sound, impartial yet attentive, holding memory alongside renewal in quiet balance. Birds moved freely, their song threading air, hollow and ridge with continuity and life. Frost traced delicate lines along roots, stones, and moss, silent markers of enduring presence and memory. Even minor human gestures, touching stone, brushing moss, inhaling softly, carried reverence, attention, and connection. Footsteps fell lightly, measured in rhythm with wind, thawing soil, and the quiet hum of life returning. Every ridge, hollow, and branch offered instruction in patience, awareness, and quiet remembrance. And beneath the patient canopy, echoes of endurance and presence merged seamlessly with life, memory, and soft reflection. Leaves rustled gently, carrying faint, delicate echoes across hollowed paths and moss-covered ridges. Veterans lingered at memorials and moss-draped roots, tracing letters and stone with thoughtful attention. Diaries and letters preserved and displayed whispered stories of courage, persistence, and observation across decades. Birds traced arcs through air, threading life, memory, and sound into hollowed paths and softened earth. Frost traced delicate geometry across roots, moss, and memorial stones, quiet witnesses to enduring presence and passage. Even minor gestures, pausing, touching moss, adjusting steps, breathing slowly, carried reverence, mindfulness, and reflection. Footsteps fell softly on thawed ground, careful to honor memory, endurance, and continuity. Every ridge, root, and branch seemed to hold story, presence, and instruction in gentle, attentive rhythm. The forest exhaled, patient and impartial, carrying both human memory and natural renewal with delicate balance. And beneath the enduring canopy, echoes beneath the trees persisted, soft, gentle, and reverent, guiding reflection and quiet observation. The forest stretched endlessly beneath a pale sky, trees swaying gently in a rhythm measured by wind and season. Moss-covered roots traced intricate patterns across the earth, soft and patient, holding centuries of growth and memory in quiet layers. Birds moved between branches, their song delicate, threading through hollowed paths and softened ridges, carrying life and continuity where absence once lingered. Veterans, locals, and wanderers alike paused occasionally, their presence gentle, respectful, and deliberate, sensing the weight of what had passed and the quiet persistence of what remained. Fallen branches and soft soil traced subtle lines of passage, revealing the forest's long memory in patterns of root, stone, and light. Even the faint scent of pine resin or damp moss seemed to carry stories older than any written record, quietly unfolding with each inhalation. Diaries, letters, and artifacts preserved in small museums whispered their fragments, echoing faintly into the hush of the present forest. Footsteps fell lightly, careful not to disturb moss, roots, or shadowed hollows, threading observation and reverence through each movement. Every ridge and hollow offered instruction in patience, endurance, and reflection, merging memory with living presence. And beneath the quiet sky, the forest exhaled slowly, holding all that had passed with gentle persistence. Sunlight filtered softly through the canopy, scattering across moss, roots, and weathered stones in quiet patterns. The forest seemed to inhale and exhale with the rhythm of wind and season, carrying echoes of lives lived, struggle endured, and moments past. Veterans lingered at moss-draped memorials, touching stone with reverence, tracing inscriptions with careful fingers, feeling the weight of history in delicate gestures. The ground beneath trees was soft with fallen needles, and the gentle reclaiming of soil cushioning every step while holding the quiet story of passage. Birds, insects, and small animals moved freely, threading life through spaces once marked by tension and persistence, restoring gentle rhythm to hollowed paths. Diaries and letters preserved across decades, whispered fragments of memory, connecting past and present through voice, thought, and reflection. Frost and dew traced subtle patterns across roots and stones, preserving memory and observation, alongside the quiet reclamation of nature. Even the smallest human gestures, brushing moss aside, pausing to inhale deeply, resting a hand on a memorial, carried presence, reflection, and reverence. Footsteps traced deliberate paths, measured in rhythm with wind, thawing soil, and the forest's patient breath. And beneath the patient canopy, the forest held life, memory, and quiet endurance in delicate, enduring balance. Branches bent softly under wind, releasing the faintest rustle of needles, echoing through hollowed ridges and moss-draped roots. Veterans, locals, and wanderers moved slowly, pausing to observe each hollow and ridge, tracing the soft contours of earth shaped by time and passage. Museums and diaries preserved faint echoes of endurance, courage, and persistence, bridging the silent stories of those long gone to those walking softly in the present. Birds traced arcs through air, carrying gentle song into spaces once dominated by absence and struggle, threading continuity through branches and moss. Roots intertwined with fragments of wire, stone, and earth, preserving subtle memory alongside the quiet reclamation of the forest. Even minor gestures, touching moss, adjusting a step, exhaling slowly, carried reverence, observation, and presence. Footsteps fell lightly, measured in rhythm with wind, sun, and the subtle pulse of returning life. Every ridge, hollow, and branch seemed to hold story, memory, and instruction. Patient and impartial, the forest exhaled softly, threading absence, endurance, and renewal into quiet, deliberate arcs. And beneath the quiet sky, every sound and silence merged into enduring reflection, soft and unbroken. Soft wind drifted through pines and hollows, carrying delicate notes of history, memory, and the slow rhythm of life returning. Veterans lingered at moss-covered ridges and weathered memorials, tracing inscriptions and roots with gentle hands. Diaries, letters, and photographs whispered fragments of human experience, presence, and endurance into the still air. The forest responded with quiet rhythm, carrying observation and reflection through each branch, root, and hollowed path. Birds and small animals threaded life and movement through hollowed ground, shaping the forest's voice into gentle, continuous song. Frost traced delicate lines along stone, moss, and root, preserving memory with patient persistence. Even subtle gestures, pausing, resting a hand on moss, inhaling softly, carried reverence, mindfulness, and reflection across hollowed ground. Footsteps fell softly, careful to honor memory, endurance, and the rhythm of renewal. Every ridge, hollow, and branch offered instruction in patience, observation, and presence. And beneath the enduring canopy, life, memory, and quiet reflection coexisted in gentle, hypnotic harmony. Light shifted slowly across moss, roots, and stones, illuminating the forest in soft golden arcs. Veterans moved slowly along hollowed paths, tracing memory with deliberate steps, observing the quiet persistence of life around them. Museums and preserved letters whispered history into the soft air, fragments of human experience carried into the hush of present observation. Birds, insects, and small animals moved freely through branches and hollows, threading life into spaces once shaped by absence and endurance. Roots and moss traced subtle lines across soil, holding memory alongside renewal, persistence alongside quiet reclamation. Even the softest gestures, touching stone, brushing moss, exhaling gently, carried weight in presence, observation, and reflection. Footsteps fell lightly across softened earth, careful to respect hollowed paths, ridges, and centuries of quiet endurance. Every ridge, hollow and branch, seemed to hold instruction in patience, awareness, and remembrance. The forest exhaled slowly, attentive to human reverence and natural renewal. And beneath the quiet sky, memory, life, and gentle reflection merged into enduring presence. Branches swayed, releasing soft rustles across hollowed ridges and moss-draped roots. Threading wind through the quiet forest, veterans lingered at memorials, tracing letters and moss with gentle fingers, threading the weight of history into their presence. Diaries and letters preserved stories of endurance, reflection, and observation, offering voices that had once moved through the forest to those who walked softly now. Birds traced slow arcs through air, carrying life and song into hollowed paths and softened ridges. Frost traced delicate filigree across roots, moss, and stones, silent witnesses to enduring passage and memory. Even minor human gestures, pausing, touching moss, adjusting steps, breathing slowly, carried reverence and reflection. Footsteps fell softly on softened ground, careful to honor memory, endurance, and continuity. Every ridge, hollow, and branch seemed to hold story, presence, and instruction in gentle rhythm. The forest exhaled, patient and impartial, threading human memory and natural renewal into quiet balance. And beneath the quiet sky, every sound and silence merged into a soft, enduring meditation. Sunlight filtered through high branches, casting gentle warmth across moss, memorials, and hollowed paths. Veterans moved through the forest slowly, pausing to observe roots, stones, and branches, connecting presence with memory. Diaries, letters, and photographs preserved enduring fragments of observation, persistence, and human experience, whispering softly through air and wind. Birds and small animals threaded life and sound into hollowed paths, shaping rhythm and continuity where absence had once dominated. Roots, moss, and soil traced subtle lines of passage, blending memory with natural reclamation. Even minor gestures, resting a hand on stone, brushing moss aside, inhaling slowly, carried reverence, presence, and reflection. Footsteps traced measured paths, soft against thawed earth, each step bridging past and present in quiet mindfulness. Every ridge, hollow, and branch held instruction in patience, awareness, and reflection, alive and remembered simultaneously. The forest exhaled softly, patient and watchful, holding memory alongside renewal. And beneath the quiet sky, the forest remembers, not in words or wounds, but in the hush that follows every storm.